Chapter 135. Perhaps it was due to his disdain for the popular horoscope divination and fortune-telling in his previous life, or perhaps it was because he had once paid the IQ tax. But Keyes' attainments in divination spells were much more shallow than other types of spells. Due to the lack of a complete belief in divination spells that exceeded level 5, the young blue dragon could not decipher any useful information even if he could construct the spell model. Fortunately, he had hired an experienced consultant in the field of spells, the half-lich Snade, in addition to his expertise in the school of necromancy, was also an expert in divination spells. Looking at the somewhat familiar crystal divination ball in front of him, Keyes asked curiously, "I always feel that the title of Pasha given by the Grand Vexial as compensation is somewhat troublesome. Can using this divination ball really increase the effectiveness of a crisis warning spell? Why can't I see anything?" As the original Alan, the soul-binding sorcerer Shurik should have operated without the strong interference of the young blue dragon. Not only did he personally give a certain amount of compensation, but the Grand Vexial, who represented the meta-government, also gave Keyes nominal authority to govern several cities and surrounding areas in the central part of the Medici Empire in exchange for the support of the Dragon Nest for the next 10 years of the North Tower's soul-cleansing operation. After rescuing the young blue dragon tribe that was oppressed by the brown dragon Cassilian, Keyes became the well-deserved temporary master of the Dragon Nest. Although he was unwilling to inherit the title of Duke of Thunder of Sirota, who was still serving in the bottomless abyss, legally speaking, the young blue dragon, as one of the only 13 Pasha of Medic, actually controlled more territory than even the average king. At this time, not only did the various Dragonkin clans and drakes under the protection of the Dragon Nest have to listen to his orders, even the 5 human cities, including Nome, had to regularly send people to report to him on tax, military, and other matters. Keyes' residence was right below the cliff where the Dragon's Heart Hall was located. This way, he did not have to worry about the stingy old dragon suspecting that he had secretly opened the treasury to steal the treasures when he returned. At the same time, he did not have to worry about the long stone stairs that the kobold servants had to climb to serve him food again. After fusing the 2 superior dragon bloodlines of the Gold Dragon and the Power Dragon, the young blue dragon's taste for food had changed to a certain extent. Originally, he did not like to use his lightning breath to roast meat, but rather carefully cooked spicy food often appeared on his table. And after every meal, drinking a cup of botanical drink that was a specialty of the Ash world, but was very similar to tea leaves in his previous life, had become a new hobby of the Dragon Nest Pasha. For this reason, he even named the drink tea, and the plant was naturally called tea leaves. The kobold servants of the Dragonkin clan walked into the room with a pot of tea. They actually did not understand why a powerful true dragon like Keyes would always transform into a weak human form. But out of their natural obedience to the master of the Dragon Nest, they still did their best to complete every task given by the young blue dragon. In fact, it was the habit of drinking tea that drove him. The plant used to brew the tea originated from a distant foreign country in the Ash world, and after being sold by merchants to the Medici Empire, its value increased by more than 100 times. For a guy like Keyes who was so rich that he could only use the soul prism, he naturally did not have enough silver to pay the bill. Although, as a 5-colored megalosaurus, a somewhat guilty way of saying it, he did not lose his character by forcibly snatching good things when he saw them. He was also worried that this would drain the pond to catch all the fish. If the subsequent tea merchants did not dare to sell near his territory, would he have to personally fly to a distant country every year to plunder? So after revealing the unique taste of the botanical drink to the ogre gourmet, he persuaded Brew to spend the silver he earned from the lower plane to purchase a large amount of tea leaves. Of course, the so-called large amount was only relative. Even if he bought all the stock in all the cities within his territory, if he brewed tea in the form of a megalosaurus, it would not be enough for him to drink alone for a few days. So for his hobby of drinking tea, Keyes had to use magic to transform into a young human every day. The young human blue dragon took the pot of hot tea and sipped it, savoring the delicate fragrance lingering between his lips and teeth and the memories of his hometown immersed in his throat. The pot of tea was emptied in an instant. Putting the pot aside, Keyes turned back and saw the steampunk half-lich's eyes, which were filled with gems and could emit all kinds of magic effects, staring at him through the crystal divining ball. What's the problem? What kind of clue does the warning spell indicate? Keyes asked in confusion. Snyder manipulated the mechanical arm and pointed at his face, indicating to his employer, the tea dregs. It's always on the tip of your tongue. Sift it 3 times until there is no dregs. Soak it in clear water, and the taste will be excellent. Riding on the palanquin between the isthmus, the Japanese general seemed to have forgotten about the crisis of the green-legged dragon snake yesterday. He fiddled with the nameless iron pot that he always asked his servant to carry with him wherever he went, and said to Brittany beside him, "The best way to soak the tea is to make it light, fresh, sweet, and clean. Although it's not as good as the sweet spring water in the Chian Mountain of our country, it's still better than the stagnant water on the ship and the rootless water directly obtained by the sorcerers from the water element plane. Add Sanshin tea, boil the water with black olive charcoal, and add my boiling and biting skills. This tea is also good to drink." When Brittany took the light green hot tea from the Japanese general, before he could put it into his mouth, he couldn't help but take a deep breath of the fragrance of the tea. To be honest, the former heir of the Medici Empire only cared about the exchange of interests with the Japanese. He didn't have a good impression of the people and the culture of the country at all. Only this magical tea made him unable to give up after tasting it. Not only could he have a wonderful experience when he drank it, but this kind of tea was also very beneficial to his body and mind. In Japan, except for some conservative nobles who still stubbornly called them slaves and refused to drink too much, the other slave owners, especially the spellcasters, admired this kind of tea very much. The warm tea drove away the chill underground. Brittany, who had just put his whole body into a black linen robe, smoothed his clothes and said to the commander of the Japanese vanguard, "General, although the Grand Vexil of the Medici Empire won't show up because of the agreement, his 3 troops, namely the sniper, the day watch, and the cross pick, are responsible for spying, fighting, and sieging respectively. They are not easy to deal with. In addition, each major city has more than 50 sorcerers and more than 5,000 warriors who have been in charge of the city's defense for generations. With the power of the vanguard, although we can conquer any city, if we are trapped in it, we will be buried in the desert." When the Japanese general heard the words of the ally arranged by the Senate, he didn't answer. He just smiled and put his hand on the lacquer box beside him. As a veteran who had been on the battlefield for decades, even a pig could become an excellent commander. After being ordered to take charge of this Vanguard Legion, he had already raised a large amount of funds from the local investors of the Imperium and purchased 2 items that were crucial to turning the situation around: a golden sword and a silver sword. Chapter 136. Brittany had always appreciated the strictness of the Japanese law, but he still could not understand why the alien humans would go through so much trouble to recreate the old customs of the Japanese during a sneak attack. The Vanguard army had opened up the secret passage in the Wall of Despair, after the Japanese general ordered the garrison to build a defensive fortress. The second military order was to build the prison of 9 prisoners. It was a kind of prison cell with 9 square grids. 8 hungry tigers, leopards, and bears were placed in the surrounding grids, and the prisoners were placed in the middle grids. The walls between the hungry beasts were made of mortar, so there was no need to worry about them fighting each other. However, they were separated from the cells in the middle cell by wooden fences. The wooden fences were circular, and the prisoners who were sent into the fences by cranes could only stand in the center of the circle. If they stood a little closer to one of the grids, they might be caught by the claws of the beasts, and they would die in the mouth of the hungry beasts. 9 years of imprisonment is an inherent Japanese custom. It has a miraculous effect in urging people to work efficiently. The Japanese general felt offended by Brittany's series of questions after he set foot on the Medici Empire's land. However, the general's instructions before he left made him suppress the anger in his heart. He pretended to be humble and explained, "The purpose of the punishment is to warn others. The 9 years of imprisonment can bring about a deterrent effect that lasts for a few days. However, the construction of this small prison itself has a great effect. The slaves, supervisors, and everyone who sees it will be spurred to work hard. After the first slave supervisor who was sentenced to the 9 prison punishment for sleeping for a while appeared, the construction speed of the fortress of the Vanguard Legion, which was already very fast, increased by a lot. At the same time, the consumption rate of the slave workers also increased by several times. Although there were beasts like the green-legged dragon snake with endless bellies that could fully utilize the value of the slaves, it was like water without a source. It would run out one day. It was still fine if they had professional skills, but if they only relied on the slaves who were engaged in heavy physical labor, they would probably run out of people after a few more days. Therefore, the Japanese general specially ordered the free swordsmen to ride on the swollen back horses and lead the do-die slave warriors to split into 3 groups to eat. On one hand, they were to scout the surrounding situation and draw up military plans. On the other hand, they were to solve some of the problem of supplies. The last and most important thing was to find new fuel for the Japanese war machine, Medici's slaves, and complete a secret mission. At this time, his direct commander led the 8th Division and a 1,000-man team of do-die slave warriors to defeat a small desert elf tribe, beheading dozens of warriors. They were counting the number of resources and slaves under the leadership of the former chief's wife's brother who had submitted. They had no choice but to take the risk and bring along some young female elves and their relatives. This was their experience when they were hunting slaves. If they did not have relatives to worry about, the female slaves would often choose to secretly end their own lives to avoid the terrible fate they were about to face. As a result, the number of captives needed to be escorted by an army of less than 1,000 people was actually more than 3 times the number. Bringing this group of foreign barbarians who had yet to be trained and were still rebellious would not only slow down the mobility of the entire team, but might even cause some unexpected harm. Sure enough, when the only scribe among the 1,000 Wushan warriors was registering, destructive trouble came to the troop. A traveler dressed as a desert elf ranger walked into the camp that was already under the control of the Japanese vanguard. He slipped in like a rare slug in the desert and accurately found the core of the division. When a ranger cut open the yurt where the division leader was resting and challenged the swordsman division leader, no one in the camp had time to intervene. For the glory of the desert elves, the ranger shouted in the desert elf language as a prelude to his attack. At the same time, he added an inaccurate accusation. "I will cut off the heads of you dirty human dogs." The Japanese division leader, who was threatened, did not disgrace his title as a swordsman. He, who was resting on the bed that belonged to the desert elf chief, instantly entered battle mode. This swordsman, who was good at the manifestation style swordsmanship, approached his opponent. In the process of sprinting, he first raised the Japanese military knife above his right shoulder and then slashed down violently to the left, completely ignoring the opponent's attack. This was the secret human/technique of the manifestation style. It was most suitable to quickly establish an advantage in close combat. If he attacked directly, he believed that he had overwhelming strength and speed. If he blocked, then with the special technique of the manifestation style, the enemy would immediately be defeated by his own weapon. The technique was good, but unfortunately, it was defeated by the equipment. The Desert Elf Ranger's reaction speed was not slow, but in fact, it was at most the same as the division leader of the Swordsman Division. Because the first move was actually a warning to the opponent, there was no advantage at all. So when the human slash came, he could only hurriedly pull out his knife to block. However, something unexpected happened. When the blades of the two weapons collided, the Japanese military officer's saber, which took 10 high-level sword slaves several years to forge, shattered into pieces like a wave hitting a reef. The light golden scimitar in the ranger's hand flashed, and the force transmitted by the broken blade did not affect it at all. While the division leader of the Swordsman Division was still in shock, his life was ended by the opponent's backhand. Although this sudden attack was short, due to the Desert Elf Ranger's angry roar, a large number of Wusong Free Folk swordsmen rushed over. The more alert warrior Du Dai was one step ahead of them and set up an encirclement. However, after the attacker threw the division leader's head out of the tent, his figure suddenly appeared like a breeze in the desert and disappeared. Everyone followed the footprints on the sand, but they were always one step behind. Often, they could only hear half of the desert elf's declaration of taking the lives of the human city's dogs before they received the heads of new victims. What was even more puzzling was that the assailant seemed to be very familiar with the Japanese military system. The people he killed were the vice captain, the quartermaster, the scribe, the slave-catching captain, the centurion, and the sergeants. These officers were in the same place with a large number of soldiers, but he did not target them at all. In this way, the elf ranger, who was seen by many with the golden sword, did not spend much effort to cause a big commotion in the Japanese vanguard division. Taking advantage of the chaos, hundreds of captured desert elf slaves successfully escaped from the camp, and dozens of them even managed to snatch mounts. The slave-catching team's warrior Du Dai was able to catch up, but the latter could only watch in the dust. Every escaping desert elf was praising the name of the ranger who had saved them, as well as the golden sword in his hand. At this time, the culprit was leisurely staying in the Japanese camp that he had just wreaked havoc. He removed the elf ranger's disguise and turned into a camel worker, serving the camel that the Japanese called the swollen back horse. Looking at the Japanese soldiers who came and went in a hurry, the shape-shifting monster sneered in an inaudible voice. Although the Japanese here were not his master who had enslaved him, the shape-shifting monster was very happy to be able to play with and kill one or two of his master's people. So much so that when the beasts around him smelled an unfamiliar camel worker and spat at him, he did not kill them. Chapter 137. Except for the known Keys Fetin, almost all the blue dragon species are fond of eating food that is burnt with lightning breath. Among them, camel meat is the favorite of this species of Megalosaurus. Take the deserts of the Ash world as an example. The tribes near the Dragon Nest territory often have the custom of raising camels. However, this type of beast was more suitable for traveling long distances than for battle. Due to the way it traveled, the camel's front and back legs moved on the same side, making it unsuitable for a shooting platform. Compared to the horse's maneuverability and charging ability, this type of beast was far inferior. But for the herdsman, raising camels is still profitable, such as offering them as a gift to the dragon nest in exchange for the protection of the blue dragon tribe. The life of the Megalosaurus, a famous dragon researcher, Blue. After Keys killed the ancient brown dragon Cusilian and saved the blue dragon's nest, he was directly conferred the title of Pasha by Medica's Grand Vexil. He was in the limelight for a while. Even the proud and arrogant other blue dragons had to admire this young and powerful member of the same race. There were even many young blue dragons who took him as an example and expressed their goodwill to the temporary leader of the dragon nest in various ways. The blazing sun was high in the sky, and it was the time when the shadow in the desert was the smallest. The three young blue dragons flying high in the sky looked like three black dots from a distance. Except for flying faster, there was no difference between them and birds. These members of the dragon nest were carrying out their duties of patrolling. This was what Keys Fetin had done before, but because their individual strength was less than 1/10 of Keys's 2 years ago, they needed to travel together to deter other dragon subspecies living in the territory. And these young dragons had another purpose for this trip. The camels raised by the Dragonborn clan had long been consumed by the greedy ancient brown dragon. They wanted to ask for some from the surrounding tribes so that they could offer a gift to the new young king. Gorgias, why we need to find a tribe near the Wall of Despair that can offer camel offerings. A blue dragon that was flapping its wings asked its leader, who was slightly older and stronger. Aren't there many human and elven tribes living near the dragon's lair? We could bring gifts back from a place closer to the dragon's lair. After all, it takes a lot of effort to fly with a camel, and it will be much easier to get materials nearby. Hearing the question, Gorgia glanced at his brother, who had hatched from a different dragon egg from the same mother. He resisted the urge to swing his tail and smack Gorgia down from the sky. Instead, he replied, "Short-tail Merus, stop showing off your knowledge." All blue dragons should know that the huge temperature difference between day and night near the Wall of Despair can breed camels with thicker humps. Shouldn't we choose the best of the best and strive for the best when offering gifts to the strongest in the dragon nest? Perhaps what he said was correct, but the way he expressed it was too insidious. The infuriated twin brother vented his dissatisfaction with Gorgias. The two young blue dragons collided with each other and wrestled as they fell to the ground. The other young blue dragon, Anidos, who was traveling with the two, saw this and helplessly covered his eyes with his claws. He had seen this kind of conversation ending countless times. Although he knew that the two brothers would not be in danger of dying even if they fell from a high altitude, it was not a problem for the great Megalosaurus to cast a levitation spell before landing. But he still folded his wings and swooped down. Anyway, the destination was not far below him. The forced landing, a height of thousands of meters, did not completely separate the two young Megalosaurus who were wrestling with each other. At the last moment, even with the levitation spell buffering them, the two still came into close contact with the soft sand. A huge sand pit appeared where the two of them crashed. Anidos, who followed closely behind, landed on the edge of the sand pit and used a low dragon roar to remind his companions that it was not a good time to fight. They had landed in the original camp of the desert elves, but it was obvious that the place had changed owners. With the keen eyesight of the Megalosaurus, Anidos easily found the traces of burning not long ago, not to mention the unfamiliar human warriors who were busy slaughtering the captives. When they saw the three uninvited guests, they began to line up and began to move closer. Gorgia, who climbed out of the sand pit first, shook his head that was a little dizzy from the impact. He quietly observed the situation around him and exchanged glances with his companion Anidos. Then Miles, who climbed out of the sand pit, was the first to speak in Draconic. "What are you waiting for? Hurry up and ask these desert elves for some camels, and also some nice-looking silver cartes." Before he could finish his words, Gorgia's dragon tail swung at him and knocked him back into the sand pit. However, this was not a personal revenge. Instead, it saved his life. A heavy crossbow bolt that was supposed to be shot at Miles' eyes hit the sharp horn on his head. The crossbow bolt that was enchanted with sharp arrow spell not only tore apart some of the scales on the young dragon's head, but the steel arrowhead was also deeply embedded in the dragon's horn. Fuck! As Anitos chanted a spell in the Draconic language, a large amount of dense fog appeared out of thin air. Gorgia, who was also prepared, released the lightning breath that he had been accumulating for a moment in the direction of the sniper who had just ambushed them with the enchanted crossbow. The blazing electric current left a charred hole in the yurt. The sniper who was hiding in the yurt took most of the damage from the lightning breath and died on the spot after letting out a short cry. Megalosaurus were born to be the best hunters. They knew how to quickly turn the tables when they were in danger. Gorgia was very clear that the enemy who was qualified to use expensive enchanted weapons was definitely not an ordinary soldier. Moreover, a long-range weapon enchanted with sharp arrow spell was too dangerous for the three young dragons. Therefore, he took the initiative to finish off the target. In this way, it would be much easier for them to escape in the air. Gorgia's judgment was undoubtedly correct. The person who had ambushed them with the crossbow was the captain of the Wusong Free Swordsmen. In the strict Wusong army, without the command of the captain of the archer and the direct order of the vice captain, the archers who were armed with long-range weapons could not effectively attack the three young dragons. The other free swordsmen and centurions could only order the slaves to rush into the thick fog, trying to reduce the space where the Megalosaurus could move by relying on the number of people. Then, they would wait for the thick fog to disperse before launching their attack. Most of these slave warriors were qualified warriors who had been trained since young. Their basic quality was that they were not afraid of death. However, it was obvious that they were like mantises trying to stop a chariot when fighting against the Megalosaurus with only their flesh and blood. Without the help of long-range attacks and spells, Their method of advancing by forming a human wall in an arc was still not effective in front of the Megalosaurus. Broken limbs and even broken bodies were constantly thrown out of the thick fog. Of course, this method of fighting with their lives in exchange for injuries was not completely useless. The three young Megalosaurus did not have the size and resistance of their leader, our main character, Keys, which made ordinary people despair. After being entangled by the duty warriors, it was difficult for them to fly. While they killed a large number of enemies, they were also injured by the enemy. Although the blades and spears of the duty warriors could not completely pierce through the scales of the Megalosaurus, the strong anesthetic applied on the scales was still very difficult to deal with. Even though the Megalosaurus had a strong resistance to the anesthetic, it gradually felt its limbs become slightly numb. Split up and attack. Short tail, you dig underground. Anidos will go first. I will bring up the rear. After we escape, immediately return to the dragon nest and report the situation. As the leader of the group, Gorgia's body was the strongest, but he also felt numb. He made a prompt decision and said to his companions. Then, he used his strength to cast a wider fog spell, which enveloped even more Japanese. Seeing an opportunity, Anidos looked at the edge of the camp and lowered his body. He pushed his dragon head into the sand and quickly pushed it towards the human wall formed by the duty warriors. Miles, who was scolded by her brother for being short-tail, did not flare up this time. Instead, after reminding Anidos to be careful, she quickly burrowed into the sand and dug out of the camp. The young dragon, Anidos' action of breaking out of the dense fog and breaking out of the encirclement caught the Japanese officer in command by surprise. A large number of duty warriors instinctively broke their original encirclement formation and chased after the young Megalosaurus. In the center of the dense fog, Gorgia, who felt the pressure of the attacks suddenly decrease, showed a cruel smile. He used lightning breath for the second time in the battle. Because the electric charge had been accumulated for a long time, the crackling hot electric current was no longer just a linear attack. A deadly net of lightning enveloped a large number of duty warriors around him. The strong smell of roasting human flesh turned the place into a purgatory of lightning. After doing all this, Gorgia immediately charged in another direction. Without the human wall blocking him, he broke out of the encirclement more easily. Just when the young blue dragon thought he was out of danger, an inconspicuous camel worker who was looking after the camel on his way to charge suddenly swung a scimitar at him. Initially, the young dragon thought that he could kill this ant with a swing of his tail, but the moment the scimitar touched him, he felt a piercing chill. He could no longer laugh at his brother's short tail. Chapter 138. Life is as beautiful as summer flowers. Death is as beautiful as autumn leaves. This was a poem that the Japanese general liked very much, and he liked the second half of it the most. It was a pity that the person who wrote this poem was just a slave from a conquered kingdom. He was not qualified to live hundreds of years longer by absorbing other people's lives like a top Japanese noble like him. Therefore, he could only be remembered by history, but he could not really become a part of history, or even change part of history. The Japanese general, who had just enjoyed the desert slave that were given to him by the team that had just returned from a hunting trip and sipped half a cup of milk, recited in the ancient language of the elves in front of the slaves, "Take the star iron to forge its edge, and refine the blazing sun to make its light. Enemies are hard to resist, day by day, holding a sword to be the king of the elves." Then, in the latter's shocked gaze, he pulled out a short sword and stabbed it into the poor female desert elf's chest. All the Japanese nobles believed that if they could seize the spirit-binding tower, which was an important legacy of the ancient Embark colonists in the Ashes world, they could become the slave masters of all the worlds with the power of the tower. The location of the West Tower and the South Tower was not known to the world, but the North Tower was in the Medici Empire and had been detected long ago. As early as more than 1,000 years ago, the Japanese Senate, which had successfully occupied the spirit-binding tower in the East, had begun to plan this expedition to the Medici Empire. Unlike the East Tower Master, Shurek, who was in the North Tower, had a secret method of using soul power, which made the Japanese nobles yearn for it. Taking advantage of the spirit-binding tower's routine soul cleansing every 1,000 years, the Japanese Senate was about to start their operation. In fact, although they had been planning this for thousands of years, it was still a hasty move. However, they had to do this. After all, the Japanese nobles were also human beings. Even if they could prolong their lives with thousands of slaves, their souls would gradually age, and their lives would wither because of this. They could not find a way to delay the aging of the soul in the East Tower, so their only hope was to seize the North Tower. The ambition to become the slave master of all the worlds and the urgent need to stop the aging of the soul were the two factors that led to this expedition. Instead of attacking the port city in the north of Medici, they chose to cross the Wall of Despair on the central border. This was the true manifestation of the common desire of all the Wusan nobles. In order to successfully occupy the desert where many ancient secrets were buried, the Council of Elders had not only looked for Brittany, a suitable guide, but also spent a lot of money to hire a large batch of elite ninjas to infiltrate the desert in advance. The story about the golden sword of the elves that they made up had been told in this land for hundreds of years. The slain alien-bed slaves were not wasted after all. Their vitality was extracted by the obsidian orb, and their souls were taken away by the weapon that took their lives. This was a technique the Japanese learned from a spirit-binding tower in the east. One thing could be used multiple times. After the Vanguard Legion commander asked the servants to clean up the garbage that had lost all vitality and turned into dried corpses from his residence, he inserted a short sword that could deprive the victim's soul into the Lurin-style disc in front of the table. In the pale, purple halo of the soul that had just been absorbed, this enchanted instrument communicated with the monsters in the distance, who were waiting for the next order. The blue dragon's tail you sent is timely. The shapeshifters will have a baby this year. The Wusan general was very satisfied with the spoils that his subordinate had cut off. The flesh of a blue dragon with similar attributes to the Megalosaurus greatly encouraged the green-footed dragon snakes under his command. Therefore, he promised to reward his subordinate for his decisiveness. He rewarded some female slaves as the mothers of the shapeshifters. At the same time, he also warned the monster that its relatives were still firmly in the hands of the Wusan Empire. Your mission of harassing the hunting party has been completed. The next step is to appear in various elven tribes, according to plan. It's best if you can gather a coalition of wandering desert elves who hate the Medicis. If you can't do that, you have to publicly lose the golden sword in a nearby city. After the announcement, the shape-shifting monster, who had turned into a Wusan swordsman, bowed to the image in the Lurin-style disc in front of him and ended the mission. This cunning monster, of course, had guessed the Wusan's intention. The Wusan wanted to use the forged golden sword of the Elf King in his hand to disrupt the situation in the Vanguard Legion's target area. It would be best to trigger a war between the desert elves and the Medicis. As a chess piece, he could be sacrificed at any time when necessary. As a neutral creature, the shape-shifting monster had thought of passively sabotaging the Wusan's plan. He could have beheaded the young blue dragon, but he chose to cut its tail. Presumably, the Megalosaurus, who had escaped, would take revenge on the Wusan. However, under the influence of the magical slave contract, although the shape-shifting monster could do something, he still had to follow his master's orders. Otherwise, his life would be in danger of being cursed. What's more, on the other side of the sea, his entire tribe was still under the control of the Wusan slave masters. As the shape-shifting monster leader, he was afraid of taking action. Thinking of these unpleasant things, the shape-shifting monster leader could not help but draw out the golden sword that he had placed high hopes on and slash the body of the Wusan Vanguard commander who had been killed by him. After the commander was turned into a pile of meat paste, the shape-shifting monster once again transformed into a desert elf ranger and quietly slipped out of the tent. After stealing a swollen back horse, he walked into the vast desert. After some consideration, the shape-shifting monster leader decided to pass the Wusan general's order with the lowest degree of completion. Therefore, the shape-shifting monster had memorized the map and went straight to the nearest human city in Medic. At the same time, the temporary fortress of the Vanguard was basically completed. After the shape-shifting monster leader gave the next order, the Wusan general led Brittany to the Heaven's Guard Pavilion, which was located in the middle of the fortress. The former prince of Medic, who was as anxious about the success of this battle as the nobles in the Wusan headquarters, looked at the temporary camp that they had painstakingly built and could not help but worry again. He advised the commander of the Vanguard army, "Why do you have to repair so many camp facilities here? Aren't we going to attack and take control of several cities in the central part of Medic? Won't this waste of manpower affect the subsequent operations?" The Wusan general did not immediately answer the question. He just signaled the accompanying spellcaster to send a signal into the night sky with a fireball spell. Then, under Brittany's shocked gaze, all the buildings in the fortress, including the towering Heaven's Guard Pavilion and the Vanguard army in the fortress, were teleported to an unfamiliar place. It turned out that as soon as the Wusan army passed through the Wall of Despair, half of the sorcerers had already gone to the target city to make preparations. With the support of the Senate and a shocking number of obsidian magic orbs as support, the Wusan fortress, which had been painstakingly built, was able to bypass the obstacles of space and become a giant siege weapon. Using the spells of the accompanying sorcerers, the Wusan general's order was immediately heard throughout the entire camp. "Target Gnome City, fire the cannons." The enchanted cannons that had been set up on the walls of the fortress roared in unison. Scorching hot bullets were shot out from the muzzles and hit the city walls of Medic not far away in front of the enemy soldiers' shocked gazes. Chapter 139. Gorgias was not dead. He had just used up all his savings to order an all-metal mechanical tail from Keys's magic consultant. The 3 teenage dragons who had escaped from the Japanese camp rushed back to the dragon's nest as fast as they could. They told Keys about the abnormal changes near the Wall of Despair. The young blue dragon, who had sensed an unusual conspiracy, immediately went to the site of the incident to investigate. The 3 teenage dragons reported that they were ambushed by Medica's army here. Keys, who was in his human form, sniffed the burnt smell in the air. The Japanese had set a fire to destroy the evidence before they retreated. The 3 ogre brothers and the half-liches were still on standby in the dragon's nest, so he could only say to the accompanying paladin, "But the surrounding cities have not been approved for military mobilization recently. There must be something wrong here." Keys and Jensen carefully searched the camp. They found several corpses wearing desert elf warrior costumes. As they were stacked together, although the outermost corpses were burned, some of the corpses in the middle were relatively intact. Looking at the fatal wounds on the desert elf warriors, the skilled paladin was the first to find some clues. The wounds on these elves are strange. Most of the wounds are on the buttocks, and the wounds were caused by slashing. Obviously, they were not caused by the standard spears of Medica's garrison. If they were using scimitars, they would not be able to make such deep wounds. Also, I have observed that they often choose to attack the opponent's wrist first when fighting. But almost none of these corpses have such wounds on their hands. Although Johnson's judgment was simple, it was very persuasive. The young blue dragon nodded. He had just used a spell to try to summon the ghosts that might be lurking in this place. After a great battle, especially in places where there had been a massacre, there would often be such incorporeal ghosts. In the world of ashes, where there were no gods, souls dissipated slowly. The possibility of 1 or 2 ghosts appearing was almost inevitable. Keys still found nothing, indicating that the executioners had made the necessary preparations in advance. This method was very similar to that of a soul-binding sorcerer. "Lord Keys, there's a new situation." A wyvern with the bloodline of the true dragon had yet to land on the ground when it reported, "Signs of a large army activity have been found 50 miles away. There are also traces of magical energy radiation." When they arrived at the Wall of Despair, the new news came one after another. The Demolic left behind at the dragon's nest used the employment contract he had signed with Keys to send a message. An unknown army has been teleported to Gnome City. The son of the former Medicus Pharaoh has broken into the city and declared himself emperor. The night before, outside Gnome City, if Keys's team were here, they would find a familiar weapon on the battlefield, the Hellscream. The standard weapon of the 9 prisons of Bader, which made the young blue dragon feel inexplicably Chinibu, was given an even more Chinibu name, the National Collapse Cannon. Just because the name was funny didn't mean that it wasn't powerful enough. It was a little overkill for a weapon from the underworld to appear on the battlefield of Mortal Kingdom. Blazing shells flew out from the barrels of the National Collapse Cannon. Taking advantage of the height of the Wusan fortress, they approached the city walls of Gnome City and fired. A round of fire from 20 National Collapse Cannons tore a huge hole in the walls of Gnome City, which were made of mixed mortar. At the same time, the trebuchets built by the Wusan craftsmen sent stone shells dipped in black oil into the city. Although the flames that ignited everywhere didn't cause too much damage, it still brought great psychological fear to the ordinary citizens. The city guards who were still on the walls of Gnome City were utterly defeated under the attack of the National Collapse Cannon. They were unable to organize a powerful counterattack. Just as the defending mages were about to use their magic to protect the city, they were ambushed by the elite ninjas who had already infiltrated the city. They used steel crossbows to shoot silent but deadly heavy crossbow bolts at the gnome mages from various angles that were difficult to detect. Several mages in gray robes who didn't cast stone protection spells on themselves were targeted and eliminated as soon as they stepped out of the defensive zone. The newly appointed governor, Gnome, ran barefooted to the meeting hall in his pajamas after his servant reported the situation in a panic. He planned to order the entire city to be on alert. Not long after he used the city's special magic communication device to seek support, the bad news of the enemy's full-scale attack came. The gangplanks on the walls of the Wusan fortress, which were originally used for warships to dock, were combined together to build dozens of paths to Gnome City's walls. The same number of suspension cables were also set up below the watchtower of Heaven's Guard Tower. A large number of Wusan swordsmen and duty slave warriors poured into Gnome City from these 2 points. In the watchtower of Heaven's Guard Tower, Brittany looked down from the railing and was shocked. It was different from the secret of concentrate the troops and attack the city gates that his father had taught him when he was young. A large number of Wusan soldiers used more advanced siege equipment to quickly cross Gnome City's walls in an orderly manner. Most of the city's defenses were useless. The few loyal servants who had followed Medica's successor also had the same look of awe as their master. The Wusan general took in the reactions of these people and was very pleased with himself. He stroked the enameled armor in front of him and sang, 5,000 soldiers in the night. The secret leader's symbol is clear. In the narrow alleys where soldiers meet in close quarters, they kill like weeds without a sound. Brittany and the others who heard his voice were the first to praise him. As if to cater to the mood of the commander, after taking over the city walls, the Wusan swordsmen and duty slave warriors split up and rushed into the streets of Gnome City in teams. The green fireworks set off by the hidden ninjas in the city were their guiding lights. These marked places of wealth in Gnome City were attacked by the Wusan army for the first time. Unlike the city defense forces that couldn't withstand a single blow, the mercenaries hired by the merchants appeared to be rather tenacious. There were even spellcasters in some of the large gambling dens and brothels. Although the spider web, grease, and lesser acid spells they cast were not very lethal, they still caused a lot of trouble for the Wusan swordsmen and duty slave warriors. A Wusan swordsman captain who was good at using 2 swords was still slaughtering the guards of the gambling dens who dared to block his way. But in the next moment, he was hit by a spell that came out of nowhere. The sticky magic threads stuck his armor to the porch. Not only were the soldiers behind unable to help him, but he also had to endure the attacks of benches and other things that were constantly thrown at him. This was much better than his colleagues. The captain who led the charge was trapped in a quicksand carpet that had been activated the moment he stepped through the door. He was instantly suffocated in the quicksand trap. What was worse was that the Wusan vanguard that attacked Gnome City's underground society were all trapped in the complicated tunnels. They were all killed by the poisonous smoke that surged into the city. There were also many spellcasters in the vanguard, but they were all busy attacking the garrison mages who were eager to participate in the defense of the city. 800 mages continuously bombarded the garrison of the gnome mages with evocation magic. With their advantage in numbers and the information provided by the ninjas, they easily ambushed and killed the newly promoted black-robed mages who dared to stand out. The Wusan mages were currently wearing down the enemy's spirit while persuading them to surrender. When the first gnome garrison mage who surrendered his real name and begged for mercy appeared, the remaining mages and white-robed apprentices all threw down their weapons and surrendered. When the Wusan were prepared, they put on slave collars with powerful binding abilities. Only then did the mages begin to assist the Wusan swordsmen and duty slave warriors in battle. Chapter 140. The rising sun shone its first rays on the earth, and the chaos that had lasted all night in Gnome City finally subsided. In the end, the difference in strength between the two sides was too great, and the vanguard army had the advantage of attacking first. The city in the middle of the Medici Empire still fell into the hands of the Japanese. However, according to the news sent out by eagles and magic messages that night, this sneak attack was defined as a righteous act of bringing order to the chaos. The person who took over all power in Gnome City, excluding the military, was the former Medici Empire pharaoh's legal successor, Brittany. I'm the rightful successor of Medici. I was only deposed because I opposed the previous pharaoh and the great Wechtel's actions of freeing all slaves except for Bite. In the meeting hall of Gnome City, Brittany took off her black robes and changed into the scarlet feather cloak that the pharaoh often wore in battle. She wore a crown adorned with sapphires and sat on a pillar. She said loudly to the person kneeling on the ground in front of her, "According to the law, after the death of the previous pharaoh, his orders should be inferior to Medici's rules of succession. I am here to take back the glory that should have belonged to me." After putting on the slave collar, there was no way to refute the words of the master. However, the captive new governor of Gnome City, who might also be the last governor, knew very well that these words were actually lies by a guide. One of the good policies of the previous pharaoh was to abolish the slave system except in the capital city of Bite. Only criminals were kept as slaves. This move allowed the Medici Empire to have a sufficient labor force. The slaves that were kept by the nobles and their manors were turned into qualified masons, carpenters, stonemasons, and hired farmers. As a result, Medici's business naturally became more prosperous, and so did its national power. Every household's purse was filled with money, and more children were able to receive an education. The new governor of Gnome City also benefited from this. Although he was only born in an ordinary family, he had the opportunity to read and write since he was young. That was how he was qualified to pass the examination and become a civil servant. He used that as a starting point and rose all the way to today's governor. The Medici Empire and its people all benefited from the abolition of slavery. Only the local nobles who used to keep slaves were dissatisfied because their interests had been infringed. The nobles who had been entrenched in the cities for hundreds or even thousands of years secretly colluded with Brittany, who was the first successor of Medici at that time. They used merchant caravans as a cover to send their private soldiers into the capital city of Bite in an attempt to overthrow the pharaoh's regime in one fell swoop. Unfortunately, the Sniffer's troops were one step ahead and had already figured out their plans. Once they all gathered in one place, the Grand Vader would personally lead a large group of magicians to suppress them mercilessly. The Medici of the nobles of Medici, Medici Empire of the nobles of Medici. Since then, the local nobles' forces have been reduced to less than a tenth. The local cities of the Medici Empire were all managed by governors who were approved by the Empire of Medici and recommended by the pharaoh. After that conspiracy, the only mastermind who escaped with his life was the exiled successor of the pharaoh, Brittany. After occupying the city, the prince, who had been wandering for many years, immediately announced that he was the pharaoh of Medica at the behest of the Japanese Senate and spread the news everywhere. It was not that Brittany did not know what kind of blow this would bring. It was just that the Japanese promised that once they had a righteous title, they would send out an even stronger army to be the ultimate help in unifying Medici. Of course, there were conditions. In exchange, the area around Nome City would be colonized by the Japanese Empire. How to deal with the original Nome City was completely up to the commander of the vanguard army. Sir General, why do you let the ruler of that small country live in the city? Why do you still want to stay in the fortress? In the hall on the top floor of Tianshou Pavilion, the Japanese general's subordinate fanned himself while pouring wine for his master. He took the opportunity to say, with his status, he is actually just a poor family in Japan. I heard that the bastard just said that he was the real owner of this land. He really is a shameless person. You bastard, be careful with your words. The Japanese general seemed unhappy, but there was no reprimand in his tone. Seeing that his trusted subordinate was trembling on the ground because of his words, he chuckled and continued. What do you know? I have my reasons for not entering the city. First of all, the city in this remote place is not as safe as the Japanese fortress. There may be remnants of bandits in the city who are planning to take lives. Second of all, I don't want to do anything unnecessary. Once the mages are done with their work, the general may come personally with his troops. If the old man is really going to lead the army, we can just be the vantage point for him. This will show that there is a hierarchy. You must remember to be polite in everything. There was really no way to reason with him. Santos thought helplessly as he recounted his experiences in the past 10 days. He was forced by Khedive to transport contraband raw materials. He encountered demonic beasts. After escaping from demonic beasts, he was attacked by shark lizards. After surviving the frightening night in the oasis of Sawin's palace, he finally heard the news that the man-eating horse and its master were all killed. He was overjoyed and returned to Nome City to collect his wealth and prepare to revive the sand rhino caravan. However, the city was seized by bandits. This series of attacks made his fat body lose a lot of weight. At this moment, he was forced by the Japanese to build a new city wall. The fat merchant secretly felt pity for his poor life. In order to save his life, he still had to work hard. As a merchant who had traveled extensively, Santos's eyesight was not ordinary. From the way they dressed and spoke, he knew where the bandits who seized Nome City came from. It was a country of evil bandits that was only slightly stronger than the bottomless abyss and the 9 prisons of Bader. The entire country was filled with slaves. He used to think that the rumors about that country were exaggerated, but now he thought that the rumors were too subtle. The mages worked together to add a protective measure to Nome City. The wind whistled, sweeping up sand and stones, and smashing them on the backs of the slaves who were forced to build the city wall. This was the second protective measure of the Japanese. On the city wall, the slaves who were carrying gravel and mortar could only move backward in the wind. The storm mixed with dust found every crevice in their robes and boots, mixing with their sweat to form a stinky sludge. The air was dry and hot. The water quickly evaporated, leaving behind only hard mud. Santos's lips were swollen and cracked. His tongue was like a moldy cushion, stuffed in the rough inner wall of his mouth. However, he still did not dare to rest, because the whip of the supervisors would not be stopped by the storm. What was more terrifying was that after all the workers who could not bear were cut and turned into part of the construction materials to be built into the city wall. I don't know how many people will die there. Santos walked backward to the side of the wall, bent down to unload the materials, and looked at the huge building in the city. He could not help but sigh. Chapter 141. It looks like a portal. A clear voice pierced through the howling wind and reached Santos's ears. The fat merchant looked around vigilantly, but all he saw was a muscular desert elf on his left, who looked like an ordinary, silent slave. That's really a big deal. It won't be a problem to kill more than half of Nome City's population. Like Santos, Brock was also trapped in the city. After the Japanese occupied the city, the desert elf disguised himself as a laborer and blended into the team building the city wall. As a sound sorcerer, the strong wind that poured into one's ears was an extension of his eyes and ears. As a supreme warrior, the seemingly heavy labor was actually not as tiring as the training he did when he was young. He could even jump off the city wall and break into the wind barrier set up by the Japanese mages to escape alone. It was a piece of cake for him. However, unlike when he came to Nome alone, he now wanted to bring a few people with him. After dozens of days in the city, he had already become familiar with the blacksmith who sold him the weapons. The last time they met for a drink, the old man revealed that he wanted to open a branch outside of Nome. As a desert elf, Brock knew very well how important the family's iron and steel craftsmanship was to the desert tribe. If there was a blacksmith branch in Salem, not to mention the warriors' machetes and swords, even if they could only make horseshoes and cast a few pots, it would greatly improve the lives of the tribe's shepherds. Therefore, the former #1 expert of Salem, who had single-handedly defeated the Sun Sentinel, had the idea of rescuing the blacksmith family from the fallen Nome City. It was not going to be easy. The storm barrier that the Japanese mages had set up after the army had attacked the city was the first thing they had to deal with. He had no problem escaping on his own, but the old blacksmith would not be able to escape if he had to drag his family along. To break through the Japanese garrison and the storm barrier outside the city wall, he had to have some connections. Unlike in a certain world where opening doors and pulling people in was the specialty of the sorcerers, the sound sorcerers of the Ashen world could only solve problems by using various sounds. Under the guidance of the secret voice, Brock blended into the group of slaves who were repairing the city wall. This was exactly the same as Santos. However, the latter did not make such a choice because he recognized some old acquaintances instead of relying on his super intuition. In fact, as the owner of the Sand Rhino Caravan, who was rather famous throughout the Medici Empire, the fat merchant who had been in the desert for more than 30 years knew quite a few acquaintances. For example, the boss behind the scenes of the Nome Underground Society, a fellow who had interacted with him when he was still young and peddling goods in the city with his donkey. Santos knew very well who had taken over Nome City, and he was sure that his old acquaintances knew as well. Judging others by their own standards, he was probably not the only one who wanted to escape. As the leader of an underground guild, he naturally knew of many secret passageways in and out of Nome City. For the merchant, the only problem was how to persuade this acquaintance to willingly share these resources. After all, friendship is friendship, business is business. The Japanese supervisor, who was good at training slaves, would let the laborers on the city wall take turns to take a break every 6 hourglasses to chew on the dry and slightly moldy rice balls. After taking over Nome City, the food in the city was given priority to the advance army. The food that was originally provided to the duty warriors on the ships was generously distributed to the slaves as food. The leader of the underground guild scooped up a handful of water from a clay jar and swallowed it with the food before continuing. It's been a rule for so many years, I won't make an exception. Silver, fur, spices. I won't refuse anything. As long as you give me enough, I'll naturally have my ways. Glancing at the supervisor patting the city wall with the duty slave warriors, Santos patted his linen shirt, whose original color was no longer recognizable. After flipping out his empty pockets for his old acquaintance to see, he pursed his lips and said, "The things aren't here, they're in your house. An old wife, an unmarried daughter, 2 grandsons, 3 granddaughters, the son's urns of ashes, the daughter's dowry. Everyone in your family, including you, old friend, a total of 8 people. How about we go out together? I heard that you have business in Bite. You won't have to worry about making a living there." The fat merchant's words seemed to have tugged at the heartstrings of the underground guild leader. His hand gradually reached for the hemp rope beside his feet used to carry the stones, but the rough rope was firmly stepped on by a foot. Looking around again, Santos wiped the cold sweat off his forehead and said, "I don't mean any harm. After all, we've known each other for so many years, and we know each other very well. It's not surprising that I know about your family. It's said that many of the guild's best men died in yesterday's chaos. Without the protection of someone skilled in martial arts, old bones like you and me won't be able to bring so many people out." Although he didn't have the capital, at least Santos knew his old friend's weakness. In order to fight for the position of the underground guild leader, 2 of his sons, 1 of his daughters, and her husband had died tragically. He only had a few children, an unmarried daughter, and an old wife that he had to take care of. His trusted subordinates had all died during the Japanese attack yesterday. Without anyone to protect him, he wouldn't be able to bring his family out of the city safely. Although he didn't know where he hid his family, there was no place in Nome that was absolutely safe. Now that he had come out to work as a slave, he must be looking for an opportunity. Of course, Santos didn't have the resources to bring them out, but the appearance of the desert elf Brock solved the problem. While the guards weren't paying attention, the two old friends sneaked away with their new friends. After wandering around Nome for a while, they brought the people they wanted to take away with them. The leader of the underground guild was indeed wealthy. His tattered slave disguise was immediately replaced by a set of enchanted magical items. Being familiar with every alley in Nome, he easily led the group to avoid the patrolling Japanese soldiers. After a few turns, they arrived at a small yard selling manure compost. Due to the strong smell, even the dutiful slave warriors avoided this place when they were patrolling. There were very few residents in the nearby streets, and the merchants and dung carriers who were originally in charge of this place had long since fled. As a result, no one noticed that a few camel beasts had been brought out from a secret underground stable that had been screaming in fear because of the siege the previous night. A cunning jackrabbit would dig 3 caves to avoid the pursuit of a seasoned predator. A smart miner would prepare 2 inferior horses in the tunnel in case of an unexpected cave-in. No wonder this guy could become the leader of the underground guild. Santos couldn't help but secretly admire the explanation given by his old friend. Brock followed the instructions of the underground guild leader and lifted the cover of manure that was emitting a foul stench. There was actually an underground passage hidden under the heavy mud slab. The secret passage was dark, but it could accommodate 2 horses walking side by side. The group only needed to touch the wall to reach the secret base of the underground guild. This place was one of the main targets of the Japanese vanguard last night. At this time, there were still traces of a fierce battle inside the base. Just as they were about to open another secret door to escape, dozens of elite ninjas who had been lying in ambush jumped out from their hiding spots and attacked. Fortunately, Brock reacted in time and grabbed the underground guild leader who was bending over to search for the mechanism, saving him from being ambushed by the crossbow bolts. It was only when the desert elf warrior went all out and wiped out the ambushing enemies that the group was able to retreat safely. Chapter 142. Not long after Desert Elf Brock and the rest used the secret passage, the city of Nome was locked down. Under the orders of the Wusong Vanguard Legion commander, the Freedman Swordsman Squad, the Duty Slave Warrior Legion, and the original city guards who had been put on slave collars went door to door to collect wartime taxes. There are 5 people in your family. Based on 30 silver cats per person, you will need to pay a total of 150 silver coins. A few soldiers from the original city guards broke through the door of a house and translated for the Wusong Freedman Swordsman. This was one of the functions of the enchanted slave collars. With this item, the slaves could understand some of the words set by their masters. Facing the trembling head of the house, the soldier, who was also a native of Nome, kindly advised, "You are willing to give up your wealth, but not your life. If you don't have money, quickly take out something valuable to make up for it. I will help you. Forget it. You have to make a decision quickly." Even so, the small family could only come up with less than 60 silver cats worth of wealth. They did not listen to any complaints, and the city guards kept pleading on behalf of them. The leading freedman swordsman waved his hand, and 2 duty warriors drew their swords and cut down the man who was about to fight back. However, they did not take his life. They only cut him up and threw him into the wide-tailed trailer at the door. Then, they forced the family members to tie each other's hands into a string and tie them to the back of the trailer before moving on to the next house. Brittany, who was standing in the meeting hall of Nome, seemed to have gained some confidence after being announced as the overlord. He loudly questioned the commander of the vanguard about the wartime taxes order. "General, why do you have to take the risk of losing the support of the citizens to collect so many temporary taxes at once?" When he spoke, he deliberately emphasized the word temporary. However, the Wusan general was not in the mood to answer the words of the new king of a small country. His gaze had already passed through the window of the meeting hall and was fixed on the square outside the consul's residence. As the last piece of limestone was laid on the tall, door-shaped building, the accompanying mage handed over the Lurin-style plate. After checking again to make sure that the positions of the markings were set correctly, the Japanese general solemnly inserted the short sword that symbolized the commander of the advance troop into the groove in the middle of the magic tool. This Lurin disc was actually the key to open the portal. After many adjustments, the command used this object to cross the distance between the desert and the sea. A door shrouded in green light appeared out of thin air in the heart of Gnome City. "What you guys doing?" As the heir of Pharaoh, Metasai naturally had some discerning eyes. At this moment, she was already shocked beyond words. Originally, he thought that the Japanese liked to build door-shaped buildings in the center of the city just to show off their martial arts. Who would have thought that those door-shaped buildings were actually strategic buildings that connected different cities? This was obviously not the instantaneous formation he had seen yesterday. Instead, it was a semi-permanent portal. At the same time, he also had an answer to the question he had just asked. Why did the Japanese impose such a heavy wartime tax? And why did they arrest so many citizens of Gnome City who could not afford to pay the tax? Those people had probably been used in batches as the energy source to power the giant portal. He was furious, but Brittany had to continue to endure it. At this moment, he deeply felt the weight of the sapphire crown on his head. The red feathered robe that he had worn countless times in his dreams seemed to be stained with blood. As the portal stabilized, the first to cross the space and arrive at Gnome City was the Japanese Red Guard. This legion was composed of heavy cavalry, all of them wearing heavy armor and carrying long spears. There were also small axes, armor-piercing hammers, and other melee weapons hanging from their saddles. They were all pure-blooded warhorses that were tall and strong, exuding vigor. Their sleek, milk-colored bodies were like the perfect interpretation of a painter's painting of a fine steed. The Red Guard was made up of the brave swordsmen of the freedmen. Even though they were servants, they still had to be freedmen. They were famous for their fiery red armor. At this time, their armors were stacked on top of the supply wagons driven by the servant soldiers in the rear. After the Red Guard, the ones who stepped out of the portal were the archers with 6-foot-long bows on their backs. They relied on the Japanese longbows with an eccentric design, which allowed them to shoot an arrow at a rate of 6 breaths. They could shoot a 3-foot-long heavy arrow that could penetrate armor within 200 paces. In addition to the bow and arrow equipment, each archer had a light leather-bound shield hanging from their arrowheads and a short sword strapped to their waist. When the enemy broke through the long-range blockade and came close, they could immediately pull out their bows and arrows and transform into shield-wielding warriors to fight. Unlike the Red troops, who walked along the central axis of Gnome City, the Japanese archers quickly fanned out under the leadership of their respective division captains and flag captains as soon as they walked out of the portal. They occupied the highest vantage points in the city and defended the city. They were guarding against the arrival of the big shots later. As the mages fired fireballs into the sky as a warning, a medium-sized ship floating in the air slowly sailed out of the portal. Under the additional effect of levitation, this magical creation that carried the eternal glory of the Japanese Empire was like a real ship, and it went straight to Governor Gnome's mansion behind the portal. Looking at the Japanese general of the Vanguard Army kneeling on the ground in an extremely humble manner, Brittany couldn't help but feel weak in the knees. But at the last moment, in the game of rationality and dignity, the latter still had the upper hand. The pharaoh, who had just announced to the world, put one hand on his chest and bowed, performing the Medici Empire's greeting ceremony. A crimson carpet that acted as a gangway flew out from the hovering ship, and a large number of elite ninjas and the general's personal guards walked down the ship first. The former often hid in the shadows of the governor's mansion in a flash, while the latter immediately took over the defense of the central building in Gnome City, according to a rehearsed formation. Several eunuchs ran in front and back, carefully checking whether the welcoming ceremony was in accordance with the regulations. But the Japanese nobleman who was originally sitting in the ship couldn't hold back and jumped down from the side of the ship. With a loud thud, the silver-armored warrior smashed through the ceiling and landed in the middle of the meeting hall. The legendary warrior of the Japanese Empire, the general known as the Sword of the Empire, appeared in the center of Gnome City's power. The commander of the vanguard army led everyone to kneel and kowtow to the highest official wrapped in mithril armor. Amidst the praises, the silver warrior waved his hand and ordered the place to be sealed, preparing for a meeting to conquer the Medici Empire. Although he occupied the seat that originally belonged to the owner of this place, the 7-foot-tall mithril armor couldn't be stuffed into the small column seat, so everyone had to stand and participate in a meeting with him. Brittany, who had been bowing with her hands on her chest, raised her head and looked at the military leader of the Japanese Empire. Brittany, who had attended the meeting of the Senate to vote on the expedition to Medici, originally thought that the Japanese nobles were like the commander of the vanguard army. They were used to wearing luxurious clothes and indulging in all kinds of luxuries. They liked to quote from the classics and beat around the bush when they talked. They rarely practiced martial arts, and most of the time, they relied on the warrior duty to protect them on the battlefield. However, the general seemed to be a Japanese noble who was completely different from the senators. His words and actions were more like a vulgar warrior, so direct that it made one's hair stand on end. It has been proven that the wall of despair can't make the Japanese despair. Gnome City has fallen into our control. However, this is not the end. It's not even 1/3 of the battle. The Great Vexil, who has been passed down for many years, has not been beheaded. The false king of Medici still sits high on the throne, and the North Tower still stands on this land. Therefore, in accordance with the will of the Senate and the Japanese Empire, I have personally come to oversee this expedition. I now order you to spread the war across the world. Within 10 days, let the flames of war and the smoke of war reignite this desert. 20 days later, the Japanese army will lead the newly surrendered slave army and point their swords at the heart of Medici. Unlike Brittany, who was wrapped in a red feather cloak like a beast in its nest, the other people in the meeting hall were all loyal supporters of the general. Led by the general of the vanguard army, they were all in support of the general's order to spread the war across the world. They all knew that the Senate had agreed to start a full-scale war. It meant that they could start a war against the Medici Empire by conscripting slaves at will. In a country where the number of slaves was the most important factor for ranking, there weren't many opportunities like this. This was the perfect opportunity for the warriors to raise their status in the Japanese. After a short military meeting, the general only left the general of the vanguard army for a meeting. Shiro, are the green-footed dragon snakes properly deployed? There was a slight warmth in the cold silver armor, which made the Japanese general, who was over 100 years old, feel a little touched. He held back his indignation towards the green-footed dragon snakes. They were cold, dark, had soft bones, dirty skin, bad temper, cunning eyes, smelly, and hoarse voices. They can not only spit lightning, but also secrete venom. He answered his uncle's question in a sincere and concise manner. As you know, the green-footed dragon snakes have all been released from their cages. For this, we lost 5 mages, 100 free swordsmen, and several slave warriors. Please punish us, General. What do you mean? The general, who was hiding inside and controlling the tall silver armor, walked to the Japanese general's side. He wanted to pat the general's shoulder to comfort him, but when he remembered the power of the armor, he immediately withdrew his hand. He pulled out a blade that was large enough for a giant to wield from his waist and swung it forward. A small insect that had flown out of nowhere was cut in half. Shiro, this dragonfly cutter, and this mithril armor. These 3 are the things that I can rely on without worry. The green-footed dragon snakes are just like these bugs. They're just testing objects. The Japanese general suddenly looked at the bugs that fell to the ground. The Senate. His words were covered by the sound of the dragonfly cutter cutting the ceramic floor. Shiro, Do you still remember the sword art that I taught you? It's better to practice before the battle than not to prepare at all. Chapter 143. The word unwilling was clearly displayed on the face of a young blue dragon in human form. However, whether it was out of obligation as the protagonist of the ambitious author's first novel, or out of responsibility as a qualified regional ruler, he had no choice but to appear in the story at this time. After receiving the news of the fall of Gnome City, combined with the clues found near the Wall of Despair, Keyes could at least determine two accurate information. A well-prepared army had passed through the Wall of Despair and launched a surprise attack on the central region of Medici. The compensation that the Grand Vader and the soul-binding mage Shurik had given him was actually an unspoken deal, and the hidden content was the crisis he needed to deal with now. The young blue dragon did not rush to Gnome City to fight the enemy head-on. Instead, he returned directly to the territory of the dragon's lair. After all, the enemy's early actions were so successful that they must have been prepared for a long time. Even with his current legendary strength, he could suffer a great loss in the face of an unknown organized human army if he was not careful. Figuring out the ins and outs of the whole thing was the most important thing at this time. Your Excellency, the Grand Vader, you must tell me who the enemy that attacked my territory is. And after the false king of Gnome City announced that he was the tyrant, why didn't I immediately receive news of the human army of the Medici Empire? With the help of the soul-binding crystal that the first Alan Shurik had given him, which had been modified into a medium for communication spells, Keyes quickly contacted the Grand Vader, who had given him the title of Pasha of the Medici Empire. In the image formed by the spell, he saw the other party in a room with a different style from Medici's, leisurely tasting foreign delicacies. This made the young blue dragon very angry for a moment. As the guardian of the Medici Empire, your current state of work really makes me question your sense of responsibility and professional ability. So I have to ask another question. Is this a conspiracy against the dragon's lair that you already knew about? I don't care about the title of Pasha at all. If anyone wants to take over the lair of a magpie, please don't forget the fate of the brown dragon, because that is the inevitable end. In a negotiation, one had to act like a negotiation. Start by being picky and negotiate with pressure was a technique that Keyes had learned from web dramas in his previous life. It seemed that this technique worked. On the other side of the magic image, after hearing this, the Grand Vader hurriedly filled his mouth with a large cup of sake and patiently explained, "Young and powerful Megalosaurus Pasha, please understand that an old man like me has some personal interest in eating. Shurik and I only have respect for the powerful blue dragons, and we don't covet them at all. We do have the intention of using your power to intimidate a group of rascals to protect the soul-binding tower during the soul-cleansing period that occurs once every 1,000 years. But this isn't a scheme against you or the dragon nest. This attack was truly unexpected. Even though I had prepared for it, Medica's army and mage army were currently stationed at the northern port city. The fact that the Japanese were able to cross the Wall of Despair and launch a surprise attack on Gnome City was beyond my expectations. But I can assure you that I have no intention of watching from the sidelines. In fact, the operation that I am planning right now may be able to quickly solve the problem and crisis that you will face. They were all adults, and they all knew how to compromise with each other and pretend to be polite. Keyes had already obtained the information he wanted from the other party's words. As a Pinochet Megalosaurus of the lawful evil alignment, he could completely seal off the borders of the dragon lair and allow the human army to attack him without being condemned by his conscience. But what happened next forced him to do something completely different from what he had done before. Originally, after Keyes and the others returned to the dragon lair, the three ogre brothers each indulged in their own interests. Gourmet Brew was experimenting with ice, cream, and honey to enrich his Desert Series drinks, which Dr. Paru was trying to fuse his knowledge of chimeras, lower plane anatomy, and voodoo knowledge taught by the old troll. As for Ogre Blacksmith Neru, apart from happily using the skills he learned from the fire dwarves of the pickaxe unit under the Grand Vexel to redesign and forge all kinds of new weapons and equipment, he also led the Kobold clan's patrols on a routine patrol every day. At the same time, he experimented with his new weapons while hunting. But just after Keys and the Grand Vexers, smiling on the outside, but harmonious on the inside, exchange, bad news suddenly came. Paru, who was leading the patrol team, had returned to the dragon lair, but he was seriously injured. When the young blue dragon rushed to the witch doctor's residence, he saw the ogre lying on the dissecting table, undergoing surgery by Paru. Neru's life shouldn't be in danger. He just fainted after walking to the dragon lair due to excessive blood loss, Brew said with a solemn expression. The ogre witch doctor washed the wounds with potions while stitching them up. Beside him, the half-lich Snade also helped to cast spells to remove some of the accumulated elemental damage on Neru's body. Keys didn't disturb the two's work. He just carefully examined the frightening wounds. Fortunately, ogres had a naturally good physique, and Neru's astonishing physique that far exceeded that of his peers. Only then did he survive. Apart from the bruises on his arms and fists and the large areas of scorched skin on his chest and back, there was a long wound that extended from his shoulder to his torso. Neru probably didn't wear thick battle armor when he was patrolling. The muscles around the wound were cut into pieces. The shoulder joint was obviously dislocated, and the white bone was exposed. There were some shorter wounds that cut through the thick fat on the ogre's thigh, but it didn't seem to have damaged the muscles. The main arteries under the muscles weren't cut either. Thankfully, Neru was able to walk back. There was a large amount of dirt on the surface of the wound. It must have been stuck to the wound during the fight. Paru cleaned it up and piled it together. Keys used his fingers to pick up a pinch of dirt. It smelled of sweat and blood, but it was a sticky foam that had the greatest adhesive effect. The foam had a strange, rancid smell. After some analysis, Keys concluded that it was a type of saliva that could prevent the wound from healing. These were traces of a beast attack. At first, he thought that Neru's encounter was also a surprise attack by the Japanese, but judging from the wounds, it was probably a beast that could spit fire or lightning that attacked the Cobalt Dragon Patrol team, led by the ogre. But was it a group or a single beast? It was a group of serpentine beasts with multiple pairs of three-toed claws that attacked Neru. He came back with 3 beasts in his hands. Brew's words gave Keys an answer. According to the tradition of the ogres, anything that could harm an ogre would make the ogre stronger. After killing the attackers, the burly Nalu brought back the hunters who had become his prey. He didn't forget to bring back 3 ogres. The young blue dragon wasn't afraid of the scalding hot water. He reached out and scooped up the bodies of the attackers from the large cauldron that Brew had set up outside the witch doctor's residence. Although the corpses had been chopped into pieces by the gourmet for the sake of cooking, he could still tell what kind of creature it was from the relatively intact heads and 3-toed claws. As he had once carried out the duty of patrolling the dragon nest, Quest was very clear that there was no creature in this territory that could threaten the blue dragon tribe. The natural enemies of the Megalosaurus, such as the green-footed Drakas, would be hunted down and exterminated even when the ancient brown dragon Cathilian was in power. The green-footed Drakas that could injure the ogre Neru had clearly only appeared in the dragon's territory recently. The timing of their appearance coincided with the recent appearance of the Japanese army. Although he guessed that the Grand Vader and Shurik were scheming to sow discord, no matter where the provocation came from, it had indeed angered the Megalosaurus. Dragons had reversed scales, and those who touched them would die. Although this was a cliché that often appeared in web novels written about the long shoe, it was also an undeniable truth. Keys grew up in the Blue Dragon's lair, which was known for its belligerence. Even if he didn't want to be used as a tool, he wasn't afraid of war. After all, this wasn't a bloody battle, and it wasn't to the extent where legends were as numerous as dogs. They dared to brazenly attack the dragon's lair, and even severely injured the partners who had followed Keys to conquer the 9 prisons of Bader and the bottomless abyss. Either of these 2 reasons was enough to sentence the green-footed Drakas to death. While Keys was trying to deal with these enemies, they took the initiative to expose their whereabouts. A kobold from the Hellfoot clan ran over and reported that a small dragon family clan had lit a fire beacon at the edge of the dragon's lair. Using smoke as a language, the small tribe reported that a large number of monsters had attacked their settlement. When the young blue dragon led several young blue dragons and the elite warriors of the three major dragon family clans to the scene, they only saw the wreckage of collapsed buildings and the ground covered in blood, but no wreckage. Due to his extraordinary awakening of dragon-related knowledge, Keys naturally knew about the gluttonous habits of the green-footed Drakas. Presumably, the clan members who had been attacked had become food in their stomachs. There were still flames burning in the dilapidated walls, and there was also a special fragrant smell in the air after being ionized. With his keen sense of smell and strong perception of battle, Keys could easily determine that the attackers had escaped into the sand and changed their roles to become ambushers. This was the nature of the green-footed Drakas that were good at fighting in caves, but was it not also a challenge to the blue dragon who was also good at digging? However, the young blue dragon did not give up the advantage of air superiority and the idea of drilling into the cave for a fair battle. He, who had already transformed into a true dragon, revealed a cold and cruel smile that belonged only to the Megalosaurus race at the corner of his mouth. A stream of light flashed across his skin that seemed to be covered with a layer of broken diamonds, and the ability inherited from the Energizer Dragon was suddenly activated. The entire desert boiled in an instant, and the desertification turned into a sea of sand. A large amount of sand and stones were like the sea that was blown by the wind, and the raging waves formed by the sand and stones carried a large number of green-footed Drakas that were hiding in it into the sky. What followed was a powerful dragon's breath. Instead of choosing the lightning breath of the blue dragon, Keys, who was familiar with the characteristics of the opponent and was rather pragmatic, chose to use the cone-shaped flames of the golden dragon to burn the helpless opponent. Blue the ogre, who came with the young blue dragon to avenge his brother, saw the green-footed Drakas jumping in the flames like grilled prawns. He could not help but take out his own gourmet cooking guide and fiercely open the chapter 18 cooking techniques of the green-footed Drakas at the beginning and added boiled after stewing. Chapter 144. Information asymmetry would put people in an extremely passive position. Therefore, a wise decision-maker would rather lose the initiative than blindly make a move and lose the whole game. However, most people in this world overestimated their abilities. They often thought that they had seen through the opponent's trump card, but in reality, they didn't even know what they were dealing with. The Vanguard army used the green-footed Drakas as a card to deal with the Dragon's Lair. It was based on the fact that Sarota had led a large number of elite forces on an expedition to the foreign lands 2 years ago. According to the Japanese's plan, the green-footed Drakas had to deal with an ancient brown dragon named Caecilian, also known as the Sandstorm Tyrant. However, things didn't always go according to plan. Not long after these Megalosaurus were transported across the ocean to this place, a powerful Megalosaurus attacked them head-on. Keys first used his force field to destroy the ambush trap they had painstakingly designed. Then, he used his flame breath to burn almost all of the ambushers to ashes. Due to the ample food rations the green-footed Drakas had recently, the fat layer under their scales had become more and more abundant. Therefore, when they were set ablaze by the flames, no matter how they struggled to put out the flames, they couldn't do much. It wasn't until the mist summoned by the Serpent King covered the land that the sizzling sound of the flames extinguishing could be heard from time to time. The king of the green-footed Drakas, who had disguised itself as a Japanese mage, removed the effects of the spell in the mist and transformed into its true form, which was nearly 100 feet long. It knew very well that its violent lightning breath couldn't do much damage to the blue dragon, a Megalosaurus that was also proficient in lightning breath. It had originally planned to use the equally fatal snake-bind spell to strangle the leader of the Megalosaurus during the ambush. According to the information it had exchanged with the Japanese, there were probably no blue dragons in their prime in the blue dragon's lair. Therefore, with its size, it could easily deal with a few young Megalosaurus. It was a pity that Keys had never encountered a creature named Protagonist before. With the help of his passive adaptive evolution ability, he had combined the characteristics of the blue dragon, the gold dragon, and even the power dragon. He was definitely an existence that Keyes should not face so carelessly. The green-footed draconic snake king slithered forward quickly in the thick fog. It did not need to use its eyes to lock onto its prey. The dense heat-sensing cells between its nostrils and eyes allowed it to sense the location of its opponent in the dim underground and the thick fog. It only needed to sneak to a suitable distance and suddenly open its curved body like a taut spring. With the help of its solid muscles, it could instantly release enough strength to spring up and curl its prey into its tight body. Then he used his 12 pairs of sharp, three-toed claws to tear at it while slowly tightening his grip. After that, there was no more after that. The Snake King's deadly tight bind only grasped a mass of air and even hurt its own body because of the excessive force. The young blue dragon that was simulated by the spell suddenly burst like a bubble, and the real hunter slowly emerged from the invisible state. Keyes, who had been known as the Giant Skull since childhood, once again showed the amazing biting ability of his bloody mouth. Fortunately, the green-footed draconic Snake King had experienced hundreds of battles and had sensitive nerves, but about one-third of its body, including its tail, still disappeared. "Are you a gecko?" With this teasing remark in the draconic language, Keyes immediately used a wind-making spell to disperse the thick fog that shrouded the place. The green-footed draconic Snake King, who had lost its tail to survive, hurriedly used a strong lightning breath to burn its wound and stop the blood from gushing out. The green-footed draconic snakes that had survived the flame breath just now were all eyeing covetously, ready to swarm up and fight to the death with the natural enemy of the Megalosaurus at any time. On the other hand, other than the ogre blue who was constantly rubbing his fists and waiting impatiently behind Keyes, the other Dragon Clan members, such as the kobolds, seemed to be somewhat calm and unruffled in the midst of chaos. A breeze gradually rose in the desert. Perhaps a sandstorm that could bury many lives was about to arrive. Suddenly, there was a continuous cry similar to an eagle's cry in the sky, and not far away, there was also a rustling sound that seemed to be a musical instrument, or like a rattlesnake shaking its tail. With Keyes' slight nod, the Viper tribes that had submitted to the Dragonheart Hall and the Dragon Clan members behind him joined the local war with the purpose of annihilation. The wyverns swooped down from the sky, but none of them left empty-handed. They rose into the sky with the green-footed draconic snakes and randomly let go of their sharp claws to let them fall. The rattlesnakes that had already pledged their loyalty to Keyes worked even harder, and the rustling sound from their tails had turned into a gurgling sound. Under the failure of their mental immunity, even if the green-footed draconic snakes around them did not immediately fall to the ground like the eagles that the rattlesnakes had trapped, they would still temporarily lose the power to spit lightning due to dizziness. Due to the harsh living environment, the physique and willpower of the desert kobolds were far superior to their various distant relatives who could only fight with ease. Especially with the Megalosaurus personally overseeing the battle, these dragonkin kobolds that were as tall as human youths had all transformed into fierce warriors. Because they knew that the green-footed draconic snakes could also understand the draconic language. So when they swung their scimitars at the enemy, they would use a bark-like voice to roar the terrible consequences of defying the dragon's nest. When the green-footed draconic Snake King pulled a wyvern that was lunging at it to the ground and strangled it to death, it suddenly found that there were many kobolds surrounding it. "I've eaten 40 kobolds today." The ferocious beast, whose eyes were red with bloodlust, looked at the weak dragonkin who were trying to throw flying axes at it, and devoured all the wyverns that were strangled to death. It was a special ability of the Serpent King, allowing it to devour faster and eat more than its own kind. At that moment, it chose to use this method to intimidate its opponents. And this wyvern is only half full. After stewing and boiling the green-footed draconic Snake King, what other cooking methods do you think are suitable? The ogre who was proficient in the draconic language walked past the nervous desert kobolds. He stroked the edge of the whale harpoon weapon with one hand, like a chef who was ready to show off his cooking skills. But the chef was actually communicating with the ingredients under his knife. It was comparable to a scene in a N19 horror movie. Rue pondered for a moment and made a choice for the ogre. Looking at your size, it's enough to make a platter with dipping sauce and deep-fried with salt and pepper. Bru's words successfully angered the Snake King, and the lightning breath came as expected. However, this ferocious attack hit the illusion again. The ogre spat out the newly made bubble gum that could trigger the illusion spell and chewed on the devil pepper again. The ogre, who always had an idea, spat out the bursting fireball, which hit the target first, even though it was launched later. Amidst the sound of the explosion and the shock wave, the whale harpoon firmly pinned the green-footed draconic Snake King who was trying to escape by burrowing into the ground. Chapter 145. Scoundrel, madman, and dangerous was the best description Igu of Spat could receive. Such a person was able to hold the position of governor for more than 30 years only because he was the youngest uncle of the previous pharaoh. When the Medici Empire implemented the abolition of slavery, Igu, who had tens of thousands of servants, disobeyed in public but opposed in private. It was only because of his status that he was not punished. Under his rule, Spat was lifeless, and the merchants who came and went were unwilling to do business in this heavily taxed city. If not for the fact that Medica's largest river, the Nero River, flowed through here, and there were plenty of fertile land for planting after the flood, the citizens of this city would have starved to death long ago. But even so, Igu did not seem to have any remorse. He employed petty officials with bulging wallets and skilled accountants to deal with the inspection of the pasha, but used scimitars and bows to deal with the city residents who had been reduced to serfs. Under his rule, violence was both human and bureaucratic. Torture was approved by Igu, the governor, and was often used to expose any heresy that dared to slander his reputation, if there was any left. In the civil trials of Spat, torture and punishment were usually to cut off the ears and cut off the nose. It was rare to use hanging or decapitation directly. This was not out of mercy, but because they were worried about losing some valuable labor. In fact, the crueler method of cutting off the breasts and burning them with torches to stop the bleeding was also a common method. When Brittany declared itself to be the overlord in Nome City, and at the same time stated that it would protect the right of the noble to order servants at will, Igu had a very good impression of this grandnephew of his by blood. He even called a meeting of his favorite officials as soon as he received the news to discuss whether to respond to Brittany's summons and refuse to recognize the reasonable authority of the current pharaoh of Medica. Igu was confident that the one who ascended the throne of Nome would definitely use a relative like him, who was born noble, but he did not know that whether a person's position in the eyes of others was appropriate or not was actually different from his own judgment. The arrival of the Japanese army greatly increased their overall military strength. Furthermore, Nome City was a trading city. Aside from the wealth they could plunder as they pleased, the large and small merchant groups that were trapped here also provided them with a large number of camel beasts that could be used to carry heavy supplies. This greatly reduced the transportation pressure of the teleportation circle. On the day that the general arrived, the Japanese assembled a punitive army that passed through the storm barrier outside the city and headed for the surrounding cities. With a large number of sand rhinos and humpback horses, the Japanese army no longer avoided the cities and went to the desert tribes for food. Instead, they planned to attack the human cities of Medicus directly. They dismantled a large number of equipment into parts and had them carried on the backs of the camel beasts. The army marched quickly and arrived at the oasis outside Sparut before sunset. It was harvest time, and the farm outside the city that belonged to Igu's family had already finished collecting the crops early, and the drying was almost half done. When the army arrived at night, the food stored in the storage changed owners in the blink of an eye. The mages that accompanied the army set up a dark barrier, and the Japanese engineers quickly set up siege weapons in the yard. In just one night, 4 ramps and more than 10 arrow towers were erected. Although the army did not bring along powerful siege weapons like the national cannon due to the urgency of the march, dozens of catapults were enough to solve some of the problems. When the first rays of the scorching sun shone on the Nero River, the asphalt-coated stone shells whizzed toward Sparut. When the Japanese ninjas hiding in the area received the signal, they all called for the terrified serfs to rise up. The people living in the outer city were forced to flock into the city by a large number of duty slave warriors who were sharpening their swords. The Japanese elites, who were disguised among them, rose up before the city guards could close the city gates. The weapons that were originally prepared for the siege ended up being set up on the city wall of Spat. The Wusong army actually used trebuchets to bombard the city. During the period when he was in charge of the city, the cowardly Aigu did not spend a single silver coin on fortifying the city, but he built his official residence into an impregnable fortress. The fearless slave warriors of duty launched several attacks, but they were all repelled by the desert elves hired by Aigu. Why did the Untouchables say that the bandits who attacked the city were the army sent by Gnome City and Brittany to rescue them? Aigu, who was wearing a nightgown and holding a scimitar, roared loudly in the council chamber. No one dared to speak up. The crazy Aigu had just killed his wife in a fit of rage. Blood spurted out of the woman's neck and soaked the carpet. As if he felt that it was pointless to be angry with these people, Aigu turned to the valet and shouted, "Where are the garrison magicians? Sparut is under attack. Why haven't the black-robed magician and his gray-robed apprentices cast their spells to drive the bandits away?" The valet was startled by the consul's roar and quickly ran out of the door. As soon as his heel stepped out of the door, a flying scimitar slashed into the threshold. "Get that boastful old man to come see me. Quick, quick, quick!" Aigu's cry rang out again. Not long after the valet ran out, he ran back. Everyone in the council chamber saw the black-robed garrison magician captain rushing over on a flying carpet with a few gray-robed magicians. The valet quickened his pace and walked up to Aigu, as if he wanted to secretly report something. The consul couldn't care about anything else at this time. He could only lean over and lower his ear to signal the valet to pick the important things to say. "Your Excellency, the mercenaries you hired have received the scrolls signed by the garrison magicians. They're distributing the weapons." I think the valet's voice was getting smaller and smaller, but under the attraction of the contents of the words, Aigu couldn't help but get closer and closer. A cold smile gradually appeared on the young and handsome desert elf valet's face. When his hands suddenly separated from the sleeves of his robe, a pale golden blade appeared in his hand. In the blink of an eye, it was thrust under the side of the consul, who was listening attentively. After the heart was pierced, Aigu died on the spot. The shape-shifting monster who succeeded in one strike didn't care about the golden sword stuck in the consul's ribs. He turned his head and shouted to the desert elf mercenary captain who had signed a contract with Aigu. "Fortunately, I did not disappoint you. Zhu Shun will remember. The enemy is hard to resist. Day by day, the sword will be the king of the elves. The golden sword is inserted in the enemy's heart. The blood of the Pharaoh tribe of Medic will wash away the shame that humans have inflicted on our tribe for thousands of years." While the desert elf supreme warrior was stunned, the black-robed magician who had walked into the meeting hall saw Aigu's fallen body. The old captain of the Spat City's garrison magicians raised his hand and cast a spell. A fireball bombarded the desert elf valet, who seemed to be bragging to his companions. When a strange monster saw the fireball, he was secretly happy, but on the surface, he looked extremely frightened. A round object rolled out of his robe sleeve and rolled to the ground before the fireball. Following the explosion of the fireball, the round object also burst into a cloud of thick smoke. The shape-shifting monster took this opportunity to hide behind the pillar of the meeting hall. In an instant, his shape-shifting talent was activated. Under the gaze of the entire hall, a brand-new petty official of Spat City blended into the terrified crowd. "Capture those desert elf mercenaries. They are in cahoots." Strange, who was hiding in the corner, thought darkly, "I need to add fuel to the fire." Bastard. The leader of the desert elf wandering warriors, who was originally hired by Aigu, did not have the time to find out who was framing him. The old man, who was called always talking big by his dead employer, was obviously not that bad. The black-robed mage and several gray-robed mages behind him quickly seized the opportunity to attack the foreign suspect. The Desert Elf Supreme Warrior struggled to dodge some projectile spells and threw the round shield in his hand at a gray-robed magician. After the successful attack, he did not continue to fight and directly rushed out of the meeting hall. He wanted to meet up with the mercenaries. At this moment, the only thought in his mind was the golden sword. It was hard to believe that the golden sword that the desert elves had been looking for generations would appear today. He knew how afraid Igu was of death. Igu was wearing a mithril mail under his robe. Even if it was not the legendary golden sword, it was at least an ancient weapon. Otherwise, it could be so easily stabbed. In any case, this news was related to the rise and fall of the desert elves. The news that the golden sword had appeared and fallen into the hands of humans must be spread. The Grand Vader took off the golden mask and casually threw it on the cushion beside him. Then he focused on the pool of acetic acid. There were 6 cylindrical pools made of glass in the row, and the concentration of the solution ranged from 5% to 30%. He carefully observed the solution with a higher concentration of acetic acid because it would peel off the lime and begin to erode the bones. The bones of these ancient creatures were so easily damaged. The Japanese had occupied the spirit-binding tower in the east thousands of years ago. He was surprised that they, as despicable as they, knew how to explore the experimental materials left behind by the Amaska Empire. Unlike the Grand Vader, who was immersed in his exploration, not far behind him, 3 guys were sitting at a small table and playing a card game called Fight the Landlord. It was hard for ordinary people to imagine that Commander Wenfeng, the general on duty and the chief of the Fire Dwarves, who usually did not smile, would fight over a card. Sledgehammer, you must not have a right one. Commander Wenfeng stared at the weaker part of the 2 opponents and attacked fiercely. Don't worry about Sui Si. My right one is here. Do you have anything to do with it? The general on duty kept the landlord in reserve. Looking at his opponent being defeated, the Fire Dwarf used his thick fingers made of brass to carefully open the cards in his hand while letting out a sneer that sounded like a quenching iron. Of course, he and his teammates still had to stare at the card table. In addition to his mouth and ears, Swayze's ability to change cards was also outstanding. Listening to the laughter of several people, the Grand Vader turned his head to look at a Japanese senator who was tightly tied up in the corner of the room and grinned. The latter suddenly remembered that this guy was not wearing a mask at this time. He quickly closed his eyes and struggled to kowtow and beg for mercy in midair. You see, the guy who always thinks that he can win the game will definitely be seen through in the end, no matter how much preparation he has done. Following the Grand Vader's words, Commander Wenfeng's shirt suddenly burst open, and a whole deck of cards was neatly arranged in front of his opponent. Swayze is cheating. What are you going to do? The chief of the Fire Dwarves picked up the hammer at his feet. The general on duty was much calmer. He just took out some cloth and slowly wrapped it around his hands. In the territory of the Dragon's Nest, Keys received a message from the black-robed mage who was guarding Spat. The young blue dragon learned that the city had fallen and that the Archon who had the blood of the Pharaoh was assassinated by the desert elves with an enchanted sword. He looked at Brock, who came to report to him before the black-robed mage, and said with a shrug, after being the banker for 2 rounds, he wants to win the 3rd round. He even has to cheat. How can things go as one wishes? Chapter 146. In the end, the consul's mansion in the city of Spat could not hold on for much longer. Under the continuous bombardment of the Japanese ballistae, the fortress could only hold on for half a day. The desert elves, who were supposed to be the core defensive force of the fortress, betrayed the fortress after Igu was assassinated. The defending sorcerers were powerless to save the fortress. When they took off on their flying carpets, they were ambushed by the elite crossbowmen. After losing 1 or 2 sorcerers, they fled in panic. The ascension of Brittany to the throne and the easy access to manpower in the heartland of the Medici Empire really stimulated the power center of the Medici Empire. However, the Pharaoh in Bite did not punish the Megalosaurus Pasha, who was in charge of this place. It was unknown if the Grand Vader had communicated with him before. He just ordered an army to go upstream along the Nero River, intending to quell the rebellion as soon as possible. The reason the anti-rebellion army marched by water was to bring more siege equipment and supplies. According to the information reported by the Sniffer, the enemy this time should be an organized Japanese army that crossed the Wall of Despair. The fact that they could conquer two cities so quickly meant that they had sufficient manpower and equipment in advance. Therefore, although Medici's army was also fighting in the territory, they still needed to be prepared for a protracted battle. The Nero River was sparkling, and the wide surface of the river ensured that they would not encounter too much resistance, even if they were to go upstream. The north wind at this time of the year swelled the triangular sails of the flat-bottomed warships. The soldiers below the deck took turns to act as oarsmen, further increasing the speed of the warships. Not long after the sun rose, a strange figure suddenly appeared on the deck of the flagship of Medici's army. However, after the newcomer showed his identity token, the sergeant on duty respectfully led him into the warship. After entering the military conference room of the flagship, Keyes took a look at the layout of the room. Occupying the room was a well-made sand table with markings of mountains, rivers, trade routes, cities, tribal distribution, and so on. Several young staff officers were discussing the strategy of attack around the sand table. Well-armored and powerful warriors stood on both sides of the room with swords in their hands. In places where the eternal flame did not illuminate, there was a sorcerer who was not a rookie, hiding in the shadows with his black robe. The only seat in the room was prepared for the general. Keyes looked at the general. His high cheekbones suggested that he might have been as thin as a hawk in his youth, but now his chubby round face and his belly, which protruded from his armor, suggested that he was a stout, high-ranking official of Medici. There was no doubt about it. Your Excellency is the master of the Dragon's Lair, the Megalosaurus Pasha recommended by His Excellency, the Great Vexual. He was originally proud of his status, but when he thought of the race of the newcomer, he dragged his fat body and stood up to show respect. Showing a stylized smile, the general continued, "Please don't worry, I've brought a lot of good lads. I'll make sure to throw all those dirty slave masters into the Nero River to feed the fish." Keyes nodded. The human army of Medici was indeed a good card he had been looking forward to. "Then I'm relieved. After an hourglass, dock the ship. Don't worry about Spat for now. Let's go straight to Gnome City. Tomorrow morning, we'll try to get through the storm barrier outside the city." The young blue dragon in human form walked to the sand table, picked up a small flag that symbolized Medici's army, and threw it outside the miniature model of Gnome City. "What do you want?" "My army is equipped with siege weapons. We'll reach Spat in a day. We can use them to attack the city." The pot-bellied general wanted to say, "What authority do you have?" But when the words reached his mouth, it became, "What do you want?" Still, he expressed his doubts. This was within Keyes' expectations. The young blue dragon drew a line in the air, and a thin line that was vitrified by the scorching ray appeared on the sand table. "A quarter of an hour ago, your fleet had already sailed into the territory of my Pasha. According to Medici's laws, the Pasha has the highest authority to command the military of a province. If this reason isn't enough..." Keyes paused for a moment. His explanation came a little late, but fortunately, he was not absent. The flagship that was going against the current suddenly came to a stop. Due to inertia, everyone in the cabin suddenly staggered. Hidden in the shadows in the corner, the mages on duty cried out softly after hitting their heads. The sand table in the middle of the cabin almost toppled over. Medici's anti-rebellion fleet had encountered a reef area thousands of pale sand away from the mouth of the Nero River. These incredible hidden stakes at the bottom of the river were naturally the handiwork of the Neon people. After receiving news of Medici's army gathering, the mages of the Neon Empire rushed here through the night and used the power of magic to lay the foundation for a surprise attack. The hidden stakes at the bottom of the river were set up in a V shape by the spell Mud to Stone. The head of the fleet that was sailing against the current would only hit the reef when it went deep into the trap. At this time, the fleet was already huddled together, and it was not so easy to turn around. Under the water, Thick hemp ropes were tied between the thick stakes. It would be difficult for Medici's fleet to lower their sampans and land first. General Medici, who had hurriedly boarded the deck of the flagship, hurriedly ordered the fleet to retreat through flag signals. Fortunately, the retreat was downstream, and the ships that were requisitioned for this rebellion were flat-bottomed riverboats with a shallow draft. It should be, the sudden change could also be said to be a protrusion. In addition to the hidden reefs, the Neon people also set up a large number of logs tied to the bottom of the river. At this time, the logs were all cut and the ropes broke out of the water. The logs hit the bottom of the flat-bottomed warships like battering rams. Some of the logs even had elite warriors of the Neon slave army clinging to them. After the logs jumped high out of the water, they jumped to the nearest warship and boarded it to fight. These slave warriors breathed in animal urine and hid under the water to give Medici's army the first wave of head-on attacks. Looking at the warriors who boarded the warships and hacked at them, General Medici recognized the invaders from their armor and equipment. But this was not enough. It was impossible to destroy a fleet with just the hidden reefs and the water ghost army. The Neon people must have other plans. Just before he ordered the spellcasters and the long-range heavy equipment to attack indiscriminately on both sides of the river, the Neon soldiers who had been lying in ambush on both sides of the river lifted the canvas used for camouflage. Hundreds of crossbows with their bowstrings pulled taut began to shoot a rain of arrows at the trapped Medici fleet. The heavy arrows of these crossbows were smeared with asphalt. After they were fired, it looked like a rain of fire from the sky. Summoned large water elementals. The Medici spellcasters on the warships tried their best, but the summoned water elementals could not effectively fight back. They could only try to use their bodies as shields and extinguish the flames on some of the arrows. At the same time, the Neon sorcerers seized the opportunity to cast spells to drive away the elementals. They also built several paths to the center of the Nero River for the hesitant army on the shore. Under the leadership of the Free Swordsmen, a large number of Neon slave warriors launched an attack on Medici's fleet. Chapter 147. Just as Medica's big-bellied general was about to give up his command and let the soldiers fight back bravely and fearlessly, Keyes explained the second reason why he had to listen to the Megalosaurus Pasha. The Japanese ballista positions that were firing arrows at the banks of the Nero River were suddenly attacked. Rushing out of the hiding cave dug by the Drakes, the army of the Dragon Clan found the soldiers who were concentrating on aiming the ballista. Although the Japanese commanders who were supervising the battle immediately organized a resistance, they were inevitably annihilated by the short-distance charge of the Desert Kobolds and the Battle Lizardmen. Seeing this unforeseen event, the Japanese mages and Free Swordsmen immediately ordered Duty's slave warriors, who were charging towards the center of the river, to withdraw some of the rear troops to reinforce them. Unfortunately, Quest's second wave of attack followed. A few young blue dragon and wyverns appeared in the sky and launched a fierce air attack on the Japanese as soon as they appeared. The acid spat out by the wyverns was like a strong acid rain falling from the sky, and all the enemy soldiers who were drenched in it jumped into the water one after another under the stimulation of the intense pain. The young blue dragon's lightning breath was even more deadly because of this. Sparks crackled on the surface of the Nero River, and the dead Japanese warriors turned into floating corpses on the river. Without the support of the long-range troops, the slave warriors of Duty could not deal with the attack from the air, no matter how fearless they were. The young blue dragon led the wyverns to clean up the enemy as if they were plowing the ground. They did not leave until their accumulated breath was used up. After that, they saluted the master of the dragon nest who was standing on the flagship of Medica's army and left. In fact, when the dragons wantonly spread death, the Japanese mages wanted to fight back. However, under the joint attack of two powerful warriors and a ferocious ogre warlock, they were defeated one step earlier. In the end, only a few of them who had prepared escape spells in advance managed to find a chance to live. Medica's general saw that the Megalosaurus Pasha's subordinates had eliminated the well-prepared enemy so quickly. The elimination of the crisis made him feel relieved, but a new question lingered in his mind. With your Excellency's elite subordinates, why do you still need to deploy our troops? Could it be that you lack human soldiers to break through the enemy lines and charge? Keyes understood what he meant. You have such strong subordinates. Why do you still care about this army? Do you want to use this army as cannon fodder? The young blue dragon could not help but think highly of the pot-bellied general's acuity. Of course, he had this idea. The Megalosaurus and the wyverns could dominate the sky, but the range of their breath attack was only 100 feet. The effective range of a human crossbow could easily reach 2 or even 3 times the range of the breath attack. It took 3 years to train a longbowman and half a month to train crossbowmen. There were hundreds and thousands of crossbowmen in the army, but the young blue dragon, even if the wyverns were included, there were no more than 30 of them participating in the battle. The young blue dragon had no reason to use his superior talents to defeat the enemy's inferior talents, but he did not have to put all these thoughts into words. Keyes' face showed a victorious smile. General, this is war. The Medici army did not have the courage of the Japanese. After clearing the river, they left behind the ships that brought them here and built a simple dock for mooring. Keyes also tacitly agreed to the pot-bellied general's action of leaving some men behind to guard the vehicles. There was no need to push too hard. Just like in his previous life, the bosses of companies had to pay overtime even if they vigorously implemented the 996 working system in the company. Learning how to use the method of exchange to persuade had always been a compulsory course for managers. The bargaining chips obtained from the exchange were exchanged for a full 16 hourglasses of rapid march for the Medici army. Fortunately, the ships also transported a large number of camel beasts. In addition to the heavy goods, the soldiers could ride them in batches every hourglass for repair. Megalosaurus Pasha's order was not only the Empire's elite troops, but also the Emerald City and Rust City, which had not yet fallen in the province, were diverted from the garrison guards. They were led by the heralds of the Dragonborn clan and took a shortcut for the territory of the Dragon's Nest. When the 3 Medici armies gathered together, a rebellion army with a total strength of nearly 50,000 gathered outside the storm barrier surrounding Gnome City. The night in the desert was exceptionally cold. Gusts of wind leaked out from the storm barrier and played with the torches lit by the army. The Japanese had already smelled the scent of the enemy's arrival. A small group of messengers made up of several people passed through the barrier formed by the sand and storm. They brought with them an invitation to battle signed by Medici's Orthodox Pharaoh Brittany, but it was actually a letter written by the general's aide. One against one, or one army against an army. After tossing the letter into the bonfire, Quest searched the messenger who was immobilized by the Hold Monster spell and found the terracotta used to cast the spell, as well as the explosives installed on the terracotta that had yet to be ignited. At the same time, under the shocked gazes of the messengers, the spell was lifted. How dare you? Messengers. Before the leader of the messengers could finish his protest, his terracotta was thrown into the sky by Keyes. The steampunk half-lich wrapped in a hooded robe beside him reached out his metal palm and fiddled with the terracotta. A violent explosion resounded in the sky. The leader of the messengers stretched out 2 black lion claws from his robe. The lion man who was deceived vented his anger on the jackal slaves who were supposed to be loyal to him. This group of messengers turned out to be a team of monsters. As soon as they approached the camp, the young blue dragon with true sight had already seen through their disguises. Besides, Keyes, who had led the 9 prisons of Bader's army into the abyss, could smell the faint scent of the Thanner Reed demon on these monsters. The lion-headed messenger, also known as the Lamia, was an evil creature created by Graz ZT, the Six-Fingered, who corrupted the mortal slaves and spread them to the material plane. If there was a saying of helping the devil do evil in this world, then the jackals created by the demon lord who enlightened the jackals were accomplices. Due to the perverted aesthetic preferences of their creator, the Lamia, who had the upper body of a handsome human and the lower body of a four-legged lion, would often indulge in the pursuit of luxury goods. The hedonistic Lamia would often forget the orders of their demon master. But thanks to the appearance that matched Graz Zt's little hobby, these creatures eventually avoided the fate of destruction and multiplied in the material plane. They would often rob caravans and villages to obtain a series of flashy creations such as tapestries, clothes, and so on to decorate the deserted cities in the depths of the desert or the mausoleums of kings. The Lamia were rarely hired by humans, and using enslavement spells to control them was likely to anger the big boss who sat on the third level of the abyss. The lion-headed messenger is willing to crawl out of its comfortable nest to serve the Japanese. Even if Graz ZT did not personally instruct it, it must be the instructions of the abyss demons. Looking at the messenger, venting its anger, Keys thought to himself, but this arrogant fellow would never have thought that the Japanese would use it as a human bomb. And that was indeed the case. Although the lion-like creatures were mediocre in combat, aside from their advantage in size, they were good at using short daggers with their humanoid upper bodies. However, these demonic creatures were naturally good at using charming spells. They could transform into human form, and with their beautiful appearance and friendly speech, they were indeed the best choice for diplomatic personnel. Especially when they touched the enemy with their terracotta figurines, their innate talent, command, would often work. However, it didn't expect that the terracotta figurine had been tampered with. Apart from itself, the only one who could touch this magical item was the seemingly loyal jackal transformation servant. While the lion-headed messenger was hurt by the betrayal, it also felt ashamed of being fooled. The lion-headed lion was enraged, but after tearing apart the first jackal with its lion claws, it was helpless against the remaining jackals who had transformed into half-human, half-jackal forms and were wielding scimitars. Instead, it had to be careful of the latter's hypnotic gaze. With several jackals fighting in a group, the lion-headed messenger with only two eyes would fall into the trap if it was not careful. It seems that this lion-headed messenger really does not know how to fight. Who can help it? Keys, who had lost his patience, signaled Jensen to end the monster's internal strife. The paladin obeyed. The forged steel horse-chopping sword swung diagonally at the head of the roaring lion-headed messenger. Although the monster blocked the sword with its own dagger, it did not escape the fate of being knocked unconscious by the sword spine. Seeing this, the jackals scattered and fled. They used hypnotic gaze to finish off the medic soldiers surrounding them. Shield bash, evil slashing slash. The round shield infused with holy power stopped the jackals from escaping. The round shield bounced back and forth repeatedly, and every time it hit the chaotic evil creatures, it would break their bones and tendons. Only the jackals that were injured by Jensen's sword managed to escape with their lives. Keys's magic consultant casually cast a sound isolation spell. You'd better be honest. I'll ask and you answer. If there's a spell binding you, nod and shake your head. Snader lifted his hood, and 3 feet of light shot out from his mechanical head. The jackal who was affected by fear gaze hurriedly nodded and agreed. Lamia, that lion-headed messenger, served the Japanese under the instructions of the devil. The jackal nodded. That devil is Gu, the creator of your race? The jackal shook its head. Did you betray Lamia under the instructions of the Japanese or the devil? This time, the jackal answered in a barking voice. The Japanese promised us that we would be free from the enslavement of Lamia, and they would give us an island to live on. It was the same as what the green-footed draconic snake king said before its death. It seemed that the Japanese were good at using this promised land to tempt other races into becoming temporary slaves. Snader controlled the mechanical body and glanced at Keys. The young blue dragon waved his hand and tore off the sound isolation barrier. Target Gnome City. Mages with the army cast Counterstorm. Prepare to attack. At this time, the lion-headed messenger woke up from the dizziness and saw a mechanical monster with a sonorous sound with every step it took. It was slowly walking towards him with a seemingly lifeless jackal in its hand. Chapter 148. Boastful, vain, extravagant in dress, with a silk belt around his waist and a feather on his head. With a long goatee, he does things worse than beasts. They deafen you like thunder and storm. The goatees that were complained about were originally a sign of repentance. Later, they grew into a narrow, forked shape, popular among the Japanese. Now, they have become the target of mockery related to running away. A description of the last cowardly emperor in Heido Monogatari by the Japanese, the mages cast spells throughout the night to slow down the storm. According to their estimation, only after the army had passed through the wind field and reached the city could they completely break the turtle shell of the barrier. Before that, the Medici army still had to stagger forward against the strong wind. Even with the mage's suppression, the sharp teeth of the storm still gnawed at the soldiers' muscles and nerves. Several thick hemp ropes mixed with animal tendons played a big role. Thanks to the Japanese's arrangement in the Nero River, the materials that were originally used as traps were strung together to transport the supplies. Fortunately, there were these carts, which formed a safe haven for the army to take turns to rest in the sandstorm. Trudge, trudge, trudge. The pot-bellied general could not ride a horse in this weather, but he still refused the help of his guards and moved forward step by step with the help of his spear. I used to be the best soldier. With his back hunched, he rested his chin on his chest and narrowed his eyes into slits. General Medici could only feel the sand hitting his head. A large cluster of dry shrubs that looked like tumbleweeds bumped into one of his guards, and the calf-like brat was thrown to the ground. The scene made him laugh, but the price was that his mouth was filled with sand. The pot-bellied general was not heartless. He was not worried about a deliberate ambush by the Japanese. In fact, the wide storm zone of more than 10 parasan protected Nome City and the advancing Medici army at the same time. The raging wind would cause the arrows shot by the Japanese to spin as soon as they were released, and the yellow sand swept up by the wind would make a large-scale sneak attack a joke. In this environment, it was extremely difficult to walk in a straight line. With a large number of people and horses circling around, the army would be scattered in the desert in less than half an hour. The only thing that bothered him was the Megalosaurus Pasha, who forced them to abandon Zapat and move to Nome. When the Medici army entered the storm zone in order, he said goodbye to the pot-bellied general and disappeared with hundreds of people. With that monster's ability, he must have suffered less than us. The general, who was exhausted from advancing against the wind, thought with jealousy. And that was the truth. Among the refugees of Nome City that the desert elf speech Warlock Blatch had brought back to the dragon's lair, there was not only someone familiar to quests, Santos of the Sand Rhino Caravan, but also someone who knew the location of every blood vessel in Nome City. In front of a Megalosaurus, the leader of the underground society no longer cared about the life creed of friendship and business are business. He pointed out several secret passages to keys that could lead directly to the center of Nome City. In order to achieve his strategic goal, the young blue dragon planned to let the young dragons and flying dragons of the dragon lair take the risk of a sneak attack from the sky to buy time for the Medici army to reorganize after passing through the storm barrier. Originally, it was not advisable to sneak in from underground. Firstly, the large-scale earthwork of the Dragonborn clan would inevitably be detected by the mages in the city. Secondly, the time needed to dig was much more than flying over. But the information provided by the leader of the underground society perfectly solved these two problems. The other party repeatedly assured that for the sake of concealment, the secret passage exits in Nome City had been anti-detection before the incident. Without a guide, even if Nome City was razed to the ground, it would be impossible to find traces of the hidden doors hidden in the corners. So Keys let a group of people alone, and the warriors of the Dragonborn clan chose to sneak into Nome City through the underground secret passage. Hidden door, ahead, city, rich, cold. In order to prevent the pervasive Japanese ninjas from eavesdropping, Keys ordered that they only use sign language to communicate in the underground passage. But at this time, he still could not understand this kind of incision that was invented by the underground society of Nome City and used for shady transactions. After soaking the hinges of the hidden door with a grease spell, a gust of cold air seeped into the secret passage. It turned out that this was an ice cellar for the rich of Gnome City to cool off during the summer, and the Japanese did not seem to have noticed this place. It was probably because the strategic resources and large amounts of wealth in the city had not been emptied. Above us is the consul's mansion. It is said that the new consul ordered this cellar to be sealed in order to show that he was different from his predecessor's extravagant style. But before it could be used for other purposes, the Japanese invaders took over the city. After setting up a magic barrier to isolate the sound, the somewhat anxious leader of the underground society of Gnome City revealed all the information he knew in one breath. A secret passage that connected the consul's mansion to the outside of the city. Keyes looked deeply at his guide. The latter tactfully added, "Previously, the consul had a hobby of taking moon candy. It was through this secret passage that he secretly smuggled moon candy into the mansion. Then, there were specialized servants who made it into food seasoning for him. Later, for his own safety, he secretly hired people to extend the secret passage outside the city. The underground society recruited craftsmen for him and to clean up the mess. He originally wanted to say silence, but when the words reached his mouth, it became clean up the mess." Keyes realized that even the aura that he unconsciously exuded was enough to make the average person feel afraid. Thinking of this, the young blue dragon revealed an imperceptible smile. Then tonight, he would make the Japanese fear him. Hundreds of elites lay dormant in the secret passage and the ice cellar for several hourglasses. Fortunately, there was ventilation in the secret passage, so they did not feel suffocated. But the heat radiated by the people still caused a large amount of ice to melt, and the broken ice mixed with icy water flowed into the entrance of the secret passage. Of course, it would not feel good to have their boots soaked in the cold water, but these medic elites were indeed all good lads, as the leader, the big-bellied general, said. Everyone was silent. When did Gnome get out of the city? After a day of rapid marching and the first half of the night against the wind, Medica's army was extremely tired. Originally, the big-bellied general wanted to reach the city walls and set up camp first. But when he saw the fortress of the Japanese vanguard, he ordered the sergeants to stabilize the formation in time. When the sky turned bright, the clerk on horseback had already calculated the losses caused by crossing the storm barrier. 1/5 of the supplies were lost, and more than 200 people did not keep up with the troops and disappeared in the wind. The situation is not too bad, the big-bellied general comforted himself. As long as the mages could quickly calm down the damn storm, these numbers were just a draft. After wolfing down the meat jerky and lager, the soldiers took the anti-fatigue soup with ginger and laurel that was distributed by the quartermaster. Inside the fortress, the Japanese began to prepare for a counterattack. The Japanese Red Guards, who were equipped with horse armor and human armor, had already lined up in front of the city gate. A large number of free swordsmen and do-die slave warriors also lined up neatly. This was the real scene of defending a city. Usually, when they were about to run out of ammunition and food, or when there was a huge difference in numbers, the defending army would stay high on the city gate tower and only use long-range attacks to defend passively. Good lads, let's show them the power of the medic. The big-bellied general wiped his face with the ginger water and walked to the temporary command platform built by the handcart. He raised his arms and shouted to encourage the soldiers to muster up the courage. Of course, he was not crazy enough to let the tired soldiers attack the Japanese troops who had been recuperating for a long time. The 3 orders that the flag officer frantically sent out were: the archers and the ballistae would insert themselves into the formation and shoot freely. The spearmen would line up in formation to prevent the enemy cavalry from attacking, and the shield bearers would focus on their own formation. He did not let the sergeants waste time fiddling with the siege equipment parts on the supply wagons. The orders were reasonable, and he was waiting for the right time. The backyard is really on fire. Do those rotten nobles in the Senate think that anyone would want to be the emperor now? In the mansion of Governor Gnome, the former commander of the Japanese vanguard closed the book he was using to pass the time and thought to himself. The Senate had inexplicably ordered the general to be summoned to a temporary military meeting. After his uncle passed through the portal, he had no choice but to stay in this unfavorable city, waiting for the Medici to pass through the storm barrier and attack. Although he sent out a lion-headed messenger with a letter and a special gift, he knew that this little trick could only delay the enemy for a while. To him, the best-case scenario would be for his uncle to return and take control of the situation before the Métis regrouped and attacked with hatred. But how could everything go according to one's wishes? The speed of the Medic army crossing the storm barrier was faster than he had expected. He suspected that the enemy army had two sets of command systems and deployed the elite soldiers under the general to defend the city. He could not hide in the Japanese fortress outside the city as the acting general, and he did not want to put himself in danger, so he could only stay in the governor's mansion. Looking at the portal in the city center that was still operating, he felt a little relieved. He then looked at the legitimate heir of Medic, who was anxiously pacing in the meeting room. He did not know if he was trying to comfort him or tease him. At this time, the highest commander of the Japanese in the city said loudly, "Your Excellency Brittany, do not worry. A large number of anti-teleportation circles have been set up in the city. No one can cross the city wall and quietly teleport over to take you away." The violent explosion drowned out his words. The energy gushing out from the ground of the governor's mansion overturned the building, and the flames ignited the armor of the servants and guards. Groups of soldiers carrying firewood on their backs and bags of black oil on their waists rushed out of the hidden ice cellars. With the help of the combustibles they carried with them, the entire meeting room was tightly surrounded by flames. The last thing the Japanese commander saw was a huge meteor falling from the sky and hitting the base of the portal in the center of the city. The Japanese soldiers, who were lined up neatly on the city wall and outside the city, also saw this scene. The backyard is on fire. Chapter 149. It was difficult to convince one person, but it was much easier to convince a group of people. When humans were alone, their thoughts were always unpredictable, but when humans gathered together, their actions became predictable. Persuasion was the same, as was spreading fear. The neatly lined up Japanese soldiers were chased back to Nome City by the exhausted Medicis. Stability was a far cry from their mood. When hundreds of heads with Japanese hairstyles were thrown into the city by the catapults, the fire of fear began to spread. It's the head of the acting general. The general has been killed. The Shandanhu with aristocratic features attracted the attention of the Japanese defenders. Their flag and division captains recognized the identity of the head and instantly panicked. The Japanese military law was strict. If a general died in battle or was captured, not only would the whole army be beheaded, but their relatives would also be demoted to slaves. Everyone was terrified of their doomed fate, so naturally, no one cared about the defense of the city. The strategic portal in the center of the city was hit by the meteor storm. The spellcasters held on for a long time, but still failed. The collapsed basalt porch was the last straw that broke the camel's back. "Boys, those dogs are scared out of their wits. Do you want to come with me and kick their balls? Let's go together. I dare to be the vanguard." On the other hand, Medici's army had won a great victory and had a commander who was good at inciting people to cheer them on. Although they were exhausted, their morale was high. The engineers did not have time to build ramps. They only had time to set up simple ladders. The soldiers scrambled to cover their heads with their shields and climbed up the stairs with burrs. Big Belly looked at the impressive performance of his excellent young man and revealed a fatherly smile. He added fuel to the fire and said, "Don't worry. The first one to reach the city wall will be rewarded with a first-class swing, 3 levels up, and a noble title. The first team to reach the city wall will be rewarded with 100 cats of silver and 3 years of tax exemption for the family. Boys, climb steadily and fight hard. I guarantee there will be enough lager and barbecue." Ha! No one knew if it was the motivation of the first-class swing or the more practical reward of silver, lager, and barbecue, but every soldier gave it their all. Morale was a very mysterious thing. An army filled with grief is bound to win was just a lie that was often misinterpreted. Finding a way to survive was the essence of most battles. As for the Japanese soldiers who knew that they had no hope of surviving, they were like quails that had fallen into the water. They had no fighting spirit to speak of. The famous Japanese longbow archer in the Ashen World was trembling, so he could not shoot a straight arrow. The longbow in his hand was just a decoration. The National Collapse Cannon, which they had obtained from the supplier of the 9 prisons of Bader, went silent after a few shots. The only ones who could still pick up swords were the Red Guards, who were all nobles. But after they got off their horses, their heavy armor became a burden. The Red Guards also became an obstacle. The Red Guards killed the Red Guards who had no sense of honor, which caused a lot of internal strife among the Japanese. The situation was getting worse. Keyes walked to the pot-bellied general. The captured Brittany was under the care of Blue the Ogre. His mouth was stuffed with chews, and his limbs were tied to the long pole of the wailing harpoon. Looking at the flag on the city wall that had changed hands, the young Blue Dragon said slowly, "Don't think about cheating when you are the dealer. That will force others to think of ways to steal cards." Obviously, the Japanese don't understand this. Politics was a game of backstabbing. So in this game, it was very important to take care of the people behind the players. Even the general, who had almost all the military power of the Japanese, had to arrange someone to help him in the Senate. And the bull was such a chess piece. The bull was strong. He was not tall, but his shoulders were thick. At first glance, he was a villain who advocated violence. He was originally a eunuch of the last emperor of the Japanese Empire. The reason why he was able to sit in the Senate was that he strangled the emperor to death in the struggle to overthrow the emperor. In order to reward him for his achievements, the nobles of the Senate not only allowed the bull to control the Zhejiangjian talent market, but also selected him as a new noble to participate in the decisions in the court. In the eyes of others, this guy was the representative of the opposition to the general. During the voting process of the Senate, he was like a bull that had not been castrated, arguing with the general more than once. However, few people realized that it was these conflicts that allowed the general to slowly control most of the military power of the Japanese Empire. Favors must be repaid, and debts must be paid. Years ago, the general rewarded the bull with a meal for saving his life. Because of the great kindness of killing the enemy who killed his father, the bull was willing to be a slave and lurked around the last emperor. Hundreds of years later, the bull was still working hard for the promise he made. Loyalty had become the only meaning of his life. Looking at the silver warrior who walked into the hall of the Council of Elders, the bull longed to kneel down and kowtow to him openly. However, several encouraging gazes were cast at him, causing his gaze to turn cold in an instant. The general put his hand on his chest 3 times in front of his heart. Only by holding in the heart could one prove one's loyalty. After silently greeting the general in his heart for hundreds of years, he said coldly, "Mr. General, you are so arrogant. It's not the first time that you are late for a meeting of the Senate." "Humph. What are you talking about?" A noble close to the general immediately criticized the bull's behavior. Fortunately, there were other people who were busy smoothing things over, and the situation quickly subsided. Sitting at the head of the round table in the Senate, the noble speaker pressed his hands in the air, and everyone stopped talking. After the spellcasters in the hall set up anti-prophecy detection and soundproof magic circles, the oldest Japanese noble in the hall said slowly, "The Battle of Medicus is in full swing, and we shouldn't have summoned the general to come back in a hurry. It's just that some senators have raised several important issues related to the war that have to be resolved, and they urgently need a vote of the Senate." Perhaps it was because his soul was getting old. The president, who looked to be in his 40s, coughed softly. He took a sip of the tea on the table and rinsed his mouth before continuing slowly. "Everyone knows that the empire was founded by slaves. For the prosperity of Jiangxin, many of our vassal states have contributed a lot. Haha, some vassal states want to join the Senate as the next senator, and they even propose that the whole country be slaves. We have not made a unified response to this. Now that the Medicus campaign is at the critical juncture, and this area is different from others. Whether it's the population or the military strength, it can't be underestimated. Therefore, some senators have suggested that we should try to appease them, to exchange the position of senator for the title of king. Absolutely not. War has always been the continuation of politics. If we can't win on the battlefield, we can't reach an agreement with diplomatic envoys. If we try to appease them now, it will undoubtedly damage our morale. Morale can be boosted, but it can't be lost. The silver warrior stroked the hilt of his sword with one hand and interrupted the speaker. With his words interrupted, the old fox, the speaker, was naturally angry. However, after 1,000 years of keeping a low profile, he still smiled. However, as he raised his cup of tea to cover up his embarrassment, his eyes drifted to the others. There were naturally loyal dogs to serve him. The bull was the first to jump out. He stood up and stepped on the chair. The governor of the Jiangjin talent market actually acted like a rogue in the marketplace. He said in a croaky voice, 15 million silver coins. General, your expeditionary army has already bought 15 million Japanese silver coins worth of slave warriors in Zhejiang on credit before your departure. After occupying Nome City, the repayment was only a mere 130,000 silver coins. Taking into account the quality of the coins, the income of one city of Medicus is only worth 100,000 silver coins. However, Medicus only has a little over 100 cities. Even if we launder them all, we can't even repay the principal of the debt. What about the rest? We can only rely on slaves to make up for it. If we start a war of extermination, although we will win a great victory, it will be difficult to find enough high-quality goods to repay the interest under the ruins. Even if we can afford to wait, please don't forget how many slaves from other planes you have in your army. Those creditors from other planes, who have lived longer than the Japanese nobles, are all stingy demons who will calculate every minute and every second. Jiangjin and Guixian have been resting for hundreds of years. Countless slaves are traded every day. How can they not have some wealth? A cold voice rang out from the silver armor. Hearing that the general wanted to scam the Jiangjin talent market, the bull, the governor of Jiangjin, was enraged. He immediately pulled out the enchanted whip hanging on his body. Thunder gathered and played the prelude to the battle with a crackling sound. Scorch marks appeared on the ground where the whip had scratched. On the other hand, the legendary warrior opposite him seemed to regard him as an ant and did not move at all. However, a few nobles who were close to the general all stood up. It was as if they wanted to draw their swords at the slightest disagreement. Enough. You are all nobles. Where are your manners? At this time, the president threw the teacup in his hand heavily, letting the precious sky-blue porcelain shatter on the marble floor. The old fox secretly praised the bull for throwing out a last-ditch attack in time. At the same time, he was thinking about whether to ban the members from carrying weapons into the council hall in the next meeting. Of course, after persuading the two groups of people who were at loggerheads, he did not forget to put forward a plan that he had already prepared. You juniors really don't have the bearing of a general. How will you convince the masses in the future? Also, as the governor, you should know how to control your temper. That whip is used to discipline slaves. Are there any slaves in the council hall? It's my fault. In fact, the members have already suggested it, but I didn't have time to say it. As the general said, morale is the most important thing in the expedition against an empire like Medic. And the account that the governor of Jiangjin said to the other plane cannot be delayed. It is a matter of Japanese credibility. However, after consideration, this method can be used. Everyone present is one of the top nobles in Japan. Although it is costly to organize an expeditionary army, it is not a problem. In fact, these armies have already boarded the ships and are ready. As long as the general agrees to each family's crusade against Medic, the city's population will be distributed by each family. Then, the debt of Jiangjin will be shared by the nobles of the Senate. What's wrong with that? The map was unrolled and the dagger was revealed. This was the scene. However, the president's proposal was interrupted by a flying box. A noble herald, holding a mithril letterbox, knocked on the closed door of the council hall. Seeing such a high-standard military report, the mage on duty could not stop it. When the general used the special commander seal to open the magic restriction on the mithril letterbox and took out the urgent military report inside and read it, the silver warrior was immediately furious. The dragonfly cutter shone with a flickering light and cut the mithril box and the round table of the Senate into two. The general's voice, which seemed to come from the underworld, clearly rang in the ears of the nobles. After the general left, Gnome City was lost. The general of the advance army, my nephew Shiro, and the 300 red troops were all killed. The longbow army, the Dudai army, and the free swordsmen were either killed or captured. The Japanese army was defeated by Medic. The legendary warrior dragged his weapon and walked to the president of the Senate at the end of the round table. The dragonfly cutter's sewing blade cut the marble floor into pieces. No one dared to anger this powerful warrior at this time. Mr. President, I remember that 100 years ago, when we were facing the invasion of the Devil Duke, the Senate gave me the seal of full authority to mobilize the Japanese army. Today, I apply to use this seal again and order the nobles who have already prepared to attack Medic. Do you all agree? I agree. I agree. Intimidated by his imposing manner, the Senate voted almost unanimously for the general's temporary resolution, which was rare. Only the president and the governor of Jiangjin abstained for voting. After the silver warrior left, only the heavy breathing of the bull could be heard in the large council hall. The cards of the Japanese Empire were reshuffled. Chapter 150. As a representative of the long-lived species, the Megalosaurus often had foresight and wisdom. Although they weren't as scheming as the devils of Bator, they wouldn't allow the scabies to fester and fester on their bodies. In fact, because the Megalosaurus had a very high perception, even the slightest danger would make it feel like there was a thorn in its back. The life of the Megalosaurus, a famous dragon researcher brew. Due to the uniqueness of the Ashes world, there were no clergy, such as priests. Therefore, no matter which country it was in, society was often divided into two classes. The first class was represented by the king and the nobles as warriors. They established order with force and were responsible for protecting the interests of the second class with swords and knives. The second class was represented by a large number of craftsmen and merchants. They were the foundation of the first class. On the basis of equivalent exchange, they supported the first class in the form of taxes. The two-class theory was the common view of mainstream scholars in the Ashes world. But it seemed that they had deliberately or unintentionally ignored the third hidden class that really supported the first two classes. In the desert oases of the Medici Empire or other lands suitable for farming, they wore short tunics and straw hats and bent over bare-legged to work. In addition to farming, they raised pigs and sheep as a sideline to increase their income. On the other side of the sea in Japan, the people who did similar work were much worse. They were often bare-chested and used scythes, shovels, or even worse tools to work all day long. Farmers, or serfs, used their own labor to support the humans of the Ashes world. The farmers of Medici were better. At least the richer farmers could own all the land, provide for their children's education, or hire workers. The serfs of Japan were much more miserable. They worked all year long and could only keep a small part of the harvest to fill their stomachs, and their children had no possibility of jumping out of the slave class. But whether it was in Medici, where slavery was abolished, or in Japan, where slavery was fully implemented, the fate of this hidden class was tied to the land. Even Medici's farmers couldn't leave the land they were farming on. After all, humans could not survive by eating soil like some Megalosaurus. Food was the foundation of a powerful empire. The economic model that relied too much on a single source of income resulted in farmers who could only rely on the land to survive, sometimes lacked the ability to resist environmental risks like merchants. Droughts, famines, plagues, and wars could all destroy a farmer's life, especially the last one, which was the theme of the Ashes world. Even without the invasion of the Japanese, the farmers of Medici would still be harassed and robbed by the desert nomads from time to time. Of course, if the local ruler, most of the time the consul of the city, had a strong reputation and a strong voice in the region, the peasants could live and work well. But in the face of a ruler like Agu of Sparut, the peasants who lived like serfs would go to the other extreme. Like the wandering elves who were exiled by the desert elves, they would become exiles who escaped Medici's citizenship and land registration. These exiles were the main members of the desert bandits, and these bandits often called themselves the Freedom Company. They not only disrupted the security of the empire, extorted passing caravans, but also often robbed the peasant villages where they came from. There was little morality in their actions. Killing, robbing, and raping were common occurrences for them. They also occasionally colluded with the desert tribes and gathered people to extort money from the rich cities and villages. These people's bodies in the Medici Empire developed from scars to festering ulcers, and finally became suitable tools for invasion in the eyes of the Japanese. The Purchase Gang was the best of these companies. The reason was that in addition to the members of the company were exiled profiteers, fugitives, and farmers who lost their land or went bankrupt. They also had a commander who was said to be the illegitimate son of Agu of Sparut. Chaos often breeds at the edge of order. He sipped wine that he had robbed from an unlucky merchant team and played with the breasts of the young girls who had been taken as camp prostitutes. The commander of the Purchase Gang, who was more like a clown than a bard, sang loudly, using vulgar and uncivilized accents to change the poem that was once written by a Medici noble. When he sang in high spirits, he even pulled out the sword that was respectfully presented by his subordinates, slashed it twice, and ended with a chant. "And I am the commander who controls this chaos." Who gave this guy the courage to boast shamelessly? Such a villain would most likely go to hell after death. No, it should be said that he would definitely fall into the abyss. It was just unknown whether he would live like a maggot for a few days and become a dessert for other demons, or if he could really climb to the top of the demon life in the homeland of Tannery, as he said. Looking at the villains gathered together and drinking, the middle-level cadre of the Purchase Gang, which was transformed from shapeshifter, thought secretly. This strange monster still did not know that its Japanese master had been beheaded. After escaping from Sparut, it came here to continue the next phase of the order, to send out this silver sword. The general of the advance army had prepared two swords before coming to Medici, a golden sword and a silver sword. The former was used to perfect the lie, and the latter was to attract disaster. The silver sword, or silver blade, came from the distant astral world and was cherished by the Githyankis. Unless approved by the queen, any other race who held a silver blade without permission would be regarded as a stain on the honor of the Githyanki Empire. Those astral world colonists would endlessly hunt down those who held the silver blade, and the scope of the hunt would affect everyone who was related to the stain within 3 generations. When the Japanese general collected this psionic weapon, his first reaction was to divert the trouble. He sent the shapeshifter to contact the commander of the Purchase Gang because he was interested in the identity of Aigu's illegitimate son. According to the law of the Githyankis, Medici's pharaoh would be included in the purification list. As for the tyrant who would also be affected, his actual value was insignificant to the Japanese Empire at that time. The shapeshifter spy had been carefully using a special sword case that could isolate psionic radiation to preserve the silver blade. After disguising himself as a middle-level cadre of the Purchase Gang, he offered the sword, which seemed to be made of mithril, to the illegitimate son of the bandit leader. The shapeshifter pretended to cater to the bandits, but in fact, he was thinking about how to sneak away. At this time, the bandits, who were in high spirits during the banquet, didn't deserve to be treated with respect at all. Hugging a disheveled camp prostitute, the shapeshifter pretended to be impatient and wanted to go out. But when he staggered to the door of the tent, he suddenly stopped. The camp, which was originally composed of a group of mobs, was so quiet at this time. Just now, he couldn't hear the sound outside because he was in this mountain, but now, bang! A loud noise broke the noise of the Purchase Gang banquet. After being hit by the scattershot shot from the whaler's barrel, the deformed monster's body flew backward like a rag blown by a gust of wind. The dense bullet holes tore the skin of the shapeshifter, revealing the muscles and bones inside his body, which were different from the human body. Keyes, who was holding a gun, walked into the tent. At first, he was shocked by the naked banquet, and then he saw the barbecued weapon of the bandit leader. He couldn't help but say, "Good job." Chapter 151. After rubbing the dead body of the deformed monster for a while, like a child playing with ants with his head lowered, Quest stood up and asked the kobolds of the Dragonborn clan to pack up the spoils of war and take them away. Paru will probably be interested in studying it. The young blue dragon, who had transformed into a human form, shrugged and turned to look at the bastard son of Pharaoh's uncle, who was squatting and shivering in the corner of the tent. Finally, he refocused his gaze on the familiar silver blade. He, who had inherited the psionic power from the Gith sage, could feel that it was indeed a genuine silver blade, even without touching it. He was still a step too late. Although the weak radiation on the weapon had been blocked by psionic power, its signal must have been received by the signal stations widely deployed by the Astroworld colonists. Trouble would always come. It was useless to be upset. It was more practical to deal with the current affairs properly. You look like a chicken, you sweat like a pig, and you lie like a dog. What a smooth talker. The big-bellied man finished reading the dossier sent by the sniffer and pointed at the bandit leader who was cowering in the corner. After conquering Gnome City, the veteran general medic was willing to abandon his good lads and only led hundreds of guards to follow Keyes to remove the prickles left by the Wusong people. According to his own words, the marshal needed to consider the overall situation. The general only needed to keep winning battles, and the key was to understand the enemy's tricks in advance. Wait. Thanks to his inadvertent words, Keyes suddenly thought of a temporary way to deal with the stubborn pursuit of the Gith Yankees. All he needed was a good show. The young blue dragon's gaze once again turned to the bandit leader who was about to break down. This bastard son was the protagonist who was going to be pushed to the stage, but he still needed some dressing up work. Outside of Chuyun City, the capital of the Neon Empire, the expedition fleets organized by the nobles of the Council of Elders were neatly docked in rows according to the symbols of their family flags, ready to set off. The exiled slaves, serfs who were unable to work, disabled warriors, and criminals who were exiled from other colonies and vassal states were transported from Zhejiang job market. They had to contribute their last remaining value to Zhejiang. These slaves' life force and souls were converted into raw materials for the construction of a new portal. Young and strong noble apprentices were in charge of the operation. Fortunately, the slaves whose life force had been sucked dry had all turned into dried corpses. Otherwise, the dock of the Imperial Spirit Lake would have been dyed red with blood. The other end of the new portal was connected to the city of Spat in the kingdom of Medici, which was thousands of miles away. When Gnome City fell, most of the mages of the Japanese vanguard were actually deployed to this city. They were currently coordinating with their Japanese counterparts on the same task. The oily green, decaying energy and the light purple soul energy entangled with each other, building a stable spatial passage. After the mages repeatedly confirmed that the two sides were connected, the general, who had been waiting for a long time, waved his sword and ordered the nobles to start the operation. Unlike the airships that served as the flagship of the nobles' coalition, the sailors who controlled the ships on the sea could not do it as easily as the pilots. They had to concentrate on controlling the tightness of the rigging and the ropes, and carefully adjust the angle of the sails to ensure that the ships would not collide or even capsize in such a dense fleet. On the other side of the portal, night had just fallen in Medici. The moon rose in the cobalt blue sky above the stars, and the moonlight draped over the shoulders of Spat City like a thin veil. Different from the location of the portal in Gnome City, the tall porch building spanned the two sides of the Nero River like a strange bridge. Accompanied by the sound of flowing water, the Neon family's flagships sailed out of the portal and patrolled the sky above Spat City. Not long after, there were continuous squeaking sounds. There were still some collisions when the warships passed through the portal. A large number of the Neon Nobles coalition fleets continued to pour into the Nero River. Normally, With the width of the Nero River, it was normal for the waves to stop the flying ships. However, at this time, it was the flying ships that stopped the waves. The size of the Neon Nobles coalition fleets was so large that they even blocked the mother river of Medici. A large number of soldiers boarded the decks of the warships, carrying supplies and supplies. They quickly went ashore through the small ships that had been transformed into pontoons near the shore. This mixed army made up of free swordsmen from noble families and a large number of slave warriors from Dudai did not march into Spat City. Instead, they set up camp on the high platforms built by sorcerers with earth elements and strengthened by the spell mud to stone. The neon warships that were crowded in the Nero River were finally dredged, leaving only a few special warships that seemed to have a deeper draft on the surface of the river. After the confirmation signal was sent, the mages standing on the special warships activated the preset magic circle. With a rumbling sound, the magic circle connected to the inner plane of the earth elements. Under the effect of the difference in gravity, a large amount of gravel and soil gushed out like a fountain until they filled the entire cabin. These modified warships sank to the bottom of the river layer by layer in order, building a shipwreck dam that cut off the Nero River in half. When the river broke, the swamp spread for hundreds of miles. In order to revenge Keys for annihilating the vanguard, the Neon Nobles decided to release the flood demons to the land of Medici. Spat City, which was the closest to the shipwreck dam and bore the brunt of the flood, was almost instantly torn apart by the waves. The city of tens of thousands of people turned into a swamp. Key Spy lurking in the city, the strange undead puppet summoned by Snade from the skeleton of the Bugala demonic ape, had to crawl out of the tomb where it was hiding. After transmitting the situation here through the fire of the soul, it quickly transformed into a skeleton boat and sailed to the depths of the swamp. After tonight, it was foreseeable that dozens of wealthy cities in Medici along the Nero River would be affected. The loss of these imperial granaries might cause widespread famine, and when hunger swept the land, it was often accompanied by plagues. Wars, floods, famines, and plagues would always cause unavoidable deaths. Fire burned in and out of Cloud City. This city was not only the capital of the country, but also the apple of the neon's eye. Even the most stingy people would often show their generous side when dealing with their own children. The Ash world was full of deserts and lacked fresh water. Wood was a particularly precious strategic resource, but the Neon were willing to spend a lot of wood to build their city. Pavilions, cabarets, and mansions, too many wooden buildings that were considered luxurious in the eyes of foreigners appeared in this city. Occasionally, after the rainy season, some of the building materials that had not been painted yet would even have a magnificent scene of old trees and new flowers, which amazed the people of the world. But recently, these buildings had all turned into food for the fire demons. When the flames touched the buildings, they rose into the air, showing red, blue, and even miraculous green sparks due to the composition of the paint on the wood. The nobles of the Senate all had their own fiefs, but they often bought mansions in Cloud City for office and residence. The fire started in the temporary residence of a senator in the center of the city and spread in all directions. The fierce flames were like the evil spirits depicted in the paintings, their tongues sticking out and licking every inch of the materials that could be used to ignite the fire. When the flames spread along the business district to an oil mill, they detonated the oil stored in the jar. The flames rose like a sparkling fire fountain, crackling and exploding. When the flames reached the spice shop, the whole street was filled with the pungent fragrance of the expensive incense. When the flames found a rare herb stored in the storehouse of the drugstore and dried, the shop owner and doctor could not help but cry. He was so angry that he could not speak and could only beat his chest and stomp his feet. The houses collapsed in the flames, and the streets collapsed in the thick smoke. Because the general's expedition to Medici had mobilized a large number of spellcasters, the few dozen mages left in Cloud City could not take care of this city, which could be said to be the largest in the Ash world. They could only gather around the Senate and do their best to ensure that the core of the Neon Empire was not burned by the fire, and the firefighting work could only be done by the guards in the city. What are those idiots doing? Don't care about the buildings and the slaves that have been set on fire. Do your best to dig fire channels and evacuate the free people in the city. If you don't have enough people, choose from the nobles and let those little bastards put out the fire. Because of the spellcaster's protection in the Senate Hall, there was no danger of smoke and fire. After the Senate speaker vented his anger on the noble soldier, he looked at the magic sand table in the middle of the hall with the same worry as the other senators. We can't let Cloud City be burned to the ground. This was the common thought of almost all the great nobles present. This capital was not only their residence and office, but also a true portrayal of their lives that symbolized their overthrow of the Neon Empire and the establishment of unprecedented glory. Compared to the descendants of the nobles who were hundreds of years younger than them, or the overseas colonies that they had never set foot in, Cloud City was far more important in their hearts. But there was one exception. When the others were not paying attention, a noble senator standing in the corner had an imperceptible smile on his face. Under the effect of powerful command, this neon noble had become a loyal supporter of Medicus. The fire started in a mansion that he had recently bought, and because the mansion was adjacent to the business district, the fire spread so quickly. Not only that, but he also knew that even under the furious orders of the president, the city guards and nobles would not be able to do anything even if they tried their best to put out the fire. Some fire dwarves, who were not afraid of ordinary fire and had skin of copper and bones of iron, had already set up explosives all over the city. With the help of the fire, they could detonate them at any time. On the magic sand table, the fire mark appeared on the location of an oil warehouse. The Senate speaker held his forehead and sighed in pain. This seemed to have triggered a preset condition. Under the control of the powerful command spell, a dagger dipped in green poison appeared from the cuff of the puppet counselor's sleeve. He quietly circled to the side of the president and stabbed forward with all his might. For the general, fire and water were merciless, and people's hearts were unpredictable. Chapter 152. I'll enter the stage after you finish singing. The two military reports were sent to Keys almost at the same time, and he believed that the general of Neon was the same. Given that both Neon and Medic had suffered serious injuries, this war that was originally going to be a protracted war suddenly entered the decisive phase. But war was not a game. It was about winning by surprise. A surprise attack could only create a tactical advantage, but could not determine the final strategic victory. If Keys was still commanding the elite troops in the 9 prisons of Bader, he would have dared to fight even if it was a mercenary legion from another plane. But after the Nero River was blocked, it was difficult for Medica's army to rush to the battlefield quickly. In a short time, he only had tens of thousands of mortal troops under his command. Facing the well-prepared Neon army, even with the help of the Dragonborn clan, such a small number of troops was likely to be defeated, unless he personally went to the battlefield to determine the victory. But when facing the military power of a country, who knew if he would fail miserably? As a creature of the lawful evil alignment, Keys participated in the war only to avenge the seriously injured Neru and the dragon's nest that was attacked by the dragons and snakes. He did not have the consciousness to defend the territory of Pharaoh far away in Bite City. Keys was discussing with Snade, who was the magic consultant, whether there was any unorthodox magic that could reverse the current unfavorable situation. They also rejected the other party's suggestion, such as Scourge of the Dead, which was feasible but had endless consequences. Suddenly, footsteps were heard. The beach that stretches for nearly 100 pale sands. Damn it! General Medica's complaints could be heard outside the tent. At this time, his bloated waist was a burden. He had to bend down to take off his boots because the mud in his boots was unbearable. He threw the boots to his guards and walked barefoot into the bandits' tent that had just been cleaned. Last night, Keys and the others encountered a flood not long after they pulled out the thorn. The original plan to attack Spat City was therefore put on hold. After General Medich received the military intelligence, he led a small team of personal guards to survey the terrain, which made the young blue dragon look at him in a new light. The general looked at the Megalosaurus Pasha, who was squatting on the ground and talking to his weird-looking mage advisor, while teasing the undead creature called Cybertron. Early in the morning, when Big Belly led his guards out of the camp, he saw the Megalosaurus transform from a skeleton boat into a skeleton monster with 4 arms. If it weren't for Kiza's mage advisor coming out to stop them in time, the big-bellied bodyguards would have chopped up with their sickle swords. He saw that the monster had turned into a big cat and was interacting with Keys. He did not know that this was the spellcaster's behavior of adjusting the new spell creation out of curiosity. Big Belly felt a chill run down his spine, but he quickly controlled his expression. I have contacted the nearest army with eagle and spell messages. They said that it would take at least 5 days to get here, but in my opinion, that time would need to be doubled. But I heard that the Japanese have brought the newly developed floating ships here. They won't be dragged down by the mud in the beach. After giving a brief statement of the military intelligence and the analysis of the current situation to the Dragon Pasha, the big-bellied general pulled over a small stool and sat down to rest. Early in the morning, he had suffered quite a bit due to his plump body. At this time, the sergeant on duty served hot toast, bacon, and lager. Although the buyout gang camp had a lot of other food reserves, General Medich still disdained to eat food touched by the dirty hands of the bandits. He wrapped the bacon in the toast, took 2 big bites, and drank the lager. After comforting his stomach a little, Big Belly thought for a while and asked Megalosaurus Pasha, who was still waiting for his breakfast, in a casual tone, "Keys Pasha, why do you think His Excellency the Grand Vader chose to go to Izumo City, which was burning the Japanese? If there was a powerful spellcaster like him in Medich, wouldn't it be very possible to react quickly before the Japanese blocked the Nero River?" It was out of Quest's expectation that Big Belly would ask such a question. But on second thought, how could someone who could sit in the position of a general be an idiot? After organizing his words, the young blue dragon replied, "Large countries like Medich or Japan are protected by a powerful force. The situation on the battlefield can only determine the outcome of a war for a certain period of time. Once the 2 countries become hostile, the direct solution is to remove the protective force that protects the other country. This force is very strong, and it is not easy to break the shell it forms. It can quickly make a person rich enough to rival a country, and it can also destroy all of a person's wealth overnight, leaving him with nothing again. It can make the most cowardly person fearlessly walk into a fight between bandits, and it can make the most powerful warrior become a puppy licking its master's toes. It can bypass solid doors and quietly plunder treasures under layers of protection, and it can make many rich people roar like a landslide for a mere silver calf. But this force is not without weakness, and once this weakness is found by the enemy, it will not only be the shell that is penetrated. It is as loyal as a dog when it protects, and as vicious as a wolf when it betrays. The shell it forms is both a form of protection and a severe restraint. When it is broken, conscience, morality, honor, and countless other virtues will be buried with it. A mere human country will not be spared. I can also tell you that this force was first discovered by the devils of the 9 prisons of Bader, and they easily spread it throughout the multiverse. To describe this force in Medica's language, it can be transliterated as finance. And the crisis it causes is called a financial crisis. Chicken down crisis? Key shrugged and looked at the big-bellied general with his hands spread out. What would he do about it? This was a common expression when it came to economic and financial issues. In his previous life, when he was taking an elective course related to this topic, an internationally renowned professor had started his first class with a clear explanation. A small group of smart people used very complicated language and formulas that ordinary people did not want to delve into to cover up simple facts. The food prepared for the Megalosaurus Pasha was finally ready. Keys was very confident in his stomach, and he was not afraid of food that had been touched by the dirty hands of the desert bandits. In fact, his meal consumed 1/3 of the meat reserves of more than 1,000 people. Looking at the skeletal monster that transformed into a temporary dining table after the food was sent into the tent, and the dozens of roasted grouse that were placed on the table, the big-bellied general kept muttering, "Chicken down," and "chicken down crisis." He thought that he should find someone who knew magic and ask about it. The young blue dragon speculation was actually the same as the Grand Vaders across the ocean. The foundation of the Wozen Empire was a huge number of slaves, and it was inevitable that there would be a huge slave trade of the same scale, and it even involved many interdimensional trades. This could be seen from the slaves and advanced weapons that the Vanguard brought with them. In fact, the Wozen Empire's military expansion and colonial plunder for more than 1,000 years were backed by a large number of bonds and stocks. Among the merchants of the Medici Empire, there were some who were engaged in the usury business. In countries like Wozen, which often engaged in large-scale trade, there were many bankers. As the capital of a country, it often shouldered not only the role of the political and military center, but also the financial center of Wozen. And the fire that was set off by the Grand Vader's careful plan burned the financial center and burned out the credit. Chapter 153. Before Keyes could eat the last grilled grouse, smeared with hibiscus nectar and garnished with green grapes on the bone table, an important military intelligence was hurriedly delivered by a sniffer. Because the news was too urgent and confidential, no eagle or magic was used to deliver the message. Instead, someone carried the letter in a secret box and flew across the tidal flats on a flying carpet. The letter was delivered to Keyes, the Megalosaurus Pasha, overnight from the nearest city. Secret. The Japanese army is planning to launch an air attack. Their target is suspected to be Bite City. The governors of all provinces and the governors of all cities are hereby ordered to mobilize the garrison magicians to intercept them. This is an urgent order. This is an urgent order. After sharing the order with General Medici in the tent, Big Belly was so shocked that he immediately jumped up from the small stool. He immediately grabbed the guard beside him and took out the map from his backpack. Then he swept the leftover chicken on the table of the Megalosaurus Pasha and spread the map neatly. Those dogs just came out of the portal last night. How dare they attack Bite City in the middle of the night? And from the sky? This is not the rule of war at all. It doesn't make sense. He was so anxious that he was sweating profusely as he laid on the table to work on the map. However, the route that could be calculated on land was completely different from the route in the sky. Whether to go in a roundabout way or to go in a straight line, there were too many choices to consider in the sky. But his doubts did not last long. Several young blue dragon arranged by Keyes to monitor the enemy's movements in the sky brought back the information that Big Belly wanted to know. Iron-tail Gorgia, Short-tail Melis, and Anitos flapped their wings and landed in the camp of the buyout gang. Those people have prepared balloons that are even bigger than the old Red Dragon. They hung a large number of ships together under the balloons. There are also many ships that can fly without balloons on both sides. They should be heading towards Rust City. Those people are very fast. They should have reached Rust City by the time we arrived. Keyes translated the words of the Blue Dragon to Big Belly. Big Belly was lying on the map for a while. First, he circled the location of Rust City with a charcoal pencil. Then he figured out the route of the Japanese army. They were heading west and heading straight for Bite City. Although this route was long and circuitous, it avoided large cities with a large number of garrison magicians. If the Japanese army was moving as fast as the Blue Dragon reported, they would reach Bite City in less than 3 days. To make matters worse, the route the Japanese army chose was in the center of the desert, where supplies were scarce. Sometimes there would be terrible sandstorms. They didn't have to worry too much about being in the air, but it would be difficult for the garrisons and national standing legions of the other cities of Medici to intercept them. Their air fleet was escorted by the Eagle horse riders. We could only follow them from afar. We were not worried about the weak eagle horses, but we heard the growls of the red dragons. After thinking for a moment, Iron-tail Gorgia finally decided to tell the truth about the situation he wanted to hide. Maybe it was because of the last sense of honor that he did not mention the fact that he and his companions ran away immediately after hearing the growls of the red dragons. However, this blue dragon was not as knowledgeable as Keys. He did not think about the problem in a comprehensive way. If the three blue dragons could hear the growls of the red dragons, why didn't the red dragons, known for its brutality, chase after them? The red dragons had the strongest body among the five-colored megalosaurus, and the adult red dragons were heavier than the three young blue dragons combined. With a little effort, it would not take much time to catch up with the three young blue dragons and kill them. If one was simple-minded, the answer would be complicated. There were no red dragons on the airship at all. What the brothers and Anitos heard was nothing more than a dragon's roar, which was actually a trick made by some alien creature that was good at mimicking sounds. This alien creature was the Tengu clan, native to Japan. At this time, the entire clan was serving under the general. The Tengu were also known as the Fallen Birds. They were humanoid creatures with the head of a raven and feathers on their chests and backs. They always wore ill-fitting cloaks, robes, and rags. These clothes were only used to cover the smooth feathers on their bodies and slightly wrap around their exposed arms and legs. With the help of their sharp claws, the Tengu in the wild were good at climbing up branches or catching prey on cliffs. In the city, they always took light steps and swept through the crowd like the wind, not letting people notice their shameful appearance. When these guys used short swords and short bows, they were excellent hunters, thieves, and assassins. But this was not all they were capable of. Every Tengu was a master of mime. They could understand the gaseous language and the human language, but they could only communicate with each other through mimicry. The Tengu could mimic almost any sound they heard. When they asked for money, they could make the clinking sound of coins. When they asked about a busy market, they could reproduce the noise of hawkers, barking dogs, bleating sheep, and street urchins. When they mimicked sounds, the Tengu could only repeat the words and phrases they heard, but could not create new sentences. When other creatures communicated with the Tengu, they also witnessed a performance of mimicry and absurd rhythm. Dragon, dragon, dragon. That is a real dragon, the powerful megalosaurus that roams the 9 heavens. Riding the vulture horse back to the airship, the rider of the Tengu clan took off the hood that hid his face and gestured to the Japanese coachman who came to greet him. The coachman seemed to be used to the tone of this human-like creature and did not laugh. He just said hello and took the vulture horse back to the stable to take care of it. As the vulture horse was taken away, the Tengu kept staring at the wide wings of his flying mount. If there was a knowledgeable human-like behaviorist present, he would definitely read the strong emotion in the Tengu rider's expression. Envy. Yes, envy. There is no way to prove how the Tengu family was born. The most popular theory was that they were the creation of a god. Once, the Tengu also had wings and could fly with the wind and the sky. But because of coveting the ability of other higher creatures to use language, a certain Tengu found the secret of speech from his master's library. He tore up the pages and gave them to the other Tengu to read. When this situation was exposed, the kind god did not immediately send down a thunderous anger. He even considered whether to help the Tengu fix the language defect of only being able to mimic sounds. But then he saw a large number of Tengu deliberately wearing shabby clothes, begging for sympathy with the ability to mimic sounds, or simply committing fraud. That God had seen through the greed and malice in the nature of this race. Disgusted by his own creation, he was so angry that he stripped the wings of the entire heavenly dog race, turning them into beasts that could only live on the ground and look up to others. Every Tengu hoped to regain the ability to fly again, and they punished each other by humiliating their wings. Tengu that committed serious crimes would be fitted with heavy wooden wings by others of their kind and pushed off from towers or cliffs to remind the Tengu that not being able to fly was actually a tragedy. And the Japanese generalissimo gave the Tengu family the hope of rushing into the sky again to stand shoulder to shoulder with the blazing sun. That was how he easily gathered this race to serve him willingly. The leader of the Tengu family walked through the corridor full of guards and walked to the generalissimo's command cabin, which was also a lookout. White clouds float in the blue sky. Horses run under the white clouds. The Tengu has adapted to flying in the sky on the vulture horse. In your heart, fly freely. But this is not enough. You promise to let the Tengu fly with its own wings. Valiant and spirited, the little ones under my command are exceptionally spirited. Some of the attendants who were good at interpreting this kind of communication kept repeating the words of the leader of the Tengu family to the generalissimo, who was standing at the stern of the flying ship and looking down at the ground below. The silver samurai waved his hand, and the flag guards were instructed to carry out a leather case with copper edges. The leader of the Tengu family opened the leather case, but there were no artificial wings with magical powers that he expected. A special leather vest, a backpack with a metal shell, a large three-bladed dart, and some other mechanical parts that he could not recognize were neatly arranged in the leather case. Before he could question, two attendants stepped forward and took out the items in the leather case and assembled them. They first signaled the leader of the Tengu family to wear the special leather vest, and then tied the backpack full of mechanical parts to the leather vest. Finally, an unknown mechanism was pressed, and a joystick-like thing extended from the backpack, passing through the gap between the left side of the leader of the Tengu family and his left arm. It was just long enough to reach his palm. After this was done, the two attendants hurriedly took a few steps back. While the leader of the Tengu family was astonished, the sound of boiling water came from behind him. Worried about being scalded, the Tengu family hurriedly wanted to take off the vest, but the wooden floor under their feet suddenly fell down, falling without warning. As they fell, the leader of the Tengu family let out a cry that sounded like a cuckoo crying blood and a crow crying at night. As they fell, the leader of the Tengu family passed through several decks in a row. On one deck, he saw dozens of mules pushing rods to drive propellers to provide power for the flying ship. It was not a three-bladed dart at all, but a type of propeller. The propeller attached to the backpack spun rapidly under the power of steam and finally brought the leader of the Tengu family back to the sky before he crashed into the ground. The desert wind blew at the Tengu family, and the spiraling propeller also swayed left and right. But this was not a problem. The memory left in the bloodline allowed the Tengu family to quickly grasp the trick of dealing with the airflow. With the help of the joystick in his hand, the Tengu family constantly made minor adjustments and always cleverly received the help of the wind. Flying forward, flying backward, diving, rising, and, after trying all kinds of flying methods, the leader of the Tengu family finally accurately flew into the general's flying ship through the open porthole of the observation tower. This is the Cloud Ascending Wing, a single soldier flying machine developed by the #1 craftsman in Japan. You only need to sign this contract, pledging your eternal loyalty to the general, and every member of the Tengu family will have their own Cloud Ascending Wing. The attendant who had been waiting for a long time took out the bloodline contract and handed it to the pleasantly surprised leader of the Tengu family. In fact, the Cloud Ascending Wing was originally invented to equip the Japanese soldiers, but due to the weight of normal human warriors, the steam-driven propellers could not provide enough lift, so the general used it to win over the Tengu family. Henceforth, the Tengu family became slaves. Chapter 154. You will find wealth, respect, and trust here. But this also requires a trivial premise. You have to have something that can be used as collateral. High-quality slaves, rich land, ships that can go out to sea, and so on. The only condition for leniency is to have a complete seal and proof of Japanese noble bloodline. We wholeheartedly provide our noble customers with capital savings, position loans, currency exchange, commercial insurance, securities issuance, and other services. Service instructions and management regulations inscribed on the door of the first exchange house of the Japanese Empire. Strange people were nothing strange. They were nothing more than a group of waning Japanese nobles or a group of freedmen who had escaped from military service. Perhaps it had something to do with the naming habits of the Japanese. There were no gods in the Ash world, so there was no god to control them, but they still shamelessly called the dock Imperial Spirit Lake. However, there were indeed a few rocky mountains outside the cloud exiting city. Naming the city after the scenery of the cloud exiting mountain was quite appropriate. Back to the main topic. Abusi was a small leader of the strange people in the Imperial Spirit Lake. As a member of a samurai family, he tried his best to escape from military service. His behavior was despicable and was despised by his neighbors. He could only gather a group of rascals to act as his underlings and rely on extorting merchants who came to do business in the dock area to survive. After a long time, he even called himself a plain-clothed samurai. The fire in Chuyin City a few days ago was finally put out, but the fire in the city did not affect the fish in the moat. The materials of the dock buildings in the Imperial Spirit Lake were mostly cheap sea, sand, mixed with bricks. Coupled with the fact that it was adjacent to the sea, it was not affected much by the fire except for the inevitable traces of smoke. Many residents of the city poured into the dock area, bringing with them descriptions of the tragic situation in the city and allowing some people with ulterior motives to find new opportunities. Although Chuyun City looked like a ruin, in the eyes of the strange person, Abusi, it was like a dusty pearl waiting for him to pick it up. We're going to Shanghai. There is a word written in a book. Those who used to be arrogant in Chuyin City have been burned into bald quails by the fire, and no longer have the strength to fight against us. As long as we occupy a good territory at this time, we can form the first group of strange people in history to occupy Chuyin City. And the name of this organization is the Plain-Clothed Hero Alliance. She was wearing a Japanese robe that she had specially bought. Her chest was bare, and her breasts were exposed. He even used a short knife to cut his trousers to show off his chic and unrestrained style. Abe passionately gave a speech to his followers, promoting the Commoner Hero Alliance that he had imagined. But in fact, the scoundrels who made a living under this scoundrel answered the call on the surface. As he said, there were too many opportunities to make a fortune after the fire in the Yun City. But in their hearts, they were all laughing. Everyone knew that his usual trick was to suffocate people to death with incense. He led a group of scoundrels out of the Imperial Spirit Cave and stepped into Chuyin City. The streets, which used to be filled with merchants and people, were still steaming hot. Abe regretted cutting off his trousers. At this time, he didn't need to look to know that his calves and stomach were probably steamed red. However, this was the only thing he regretted. Shangluo, Chuyin City, absolutely could not shrink back. He believed that yesterday's disaster was just a burning stop in the paid story of Chuyin City. It was a charcoal-like dot, a branch of a fire spirit. And before the exclamation mark at the end of the next sentence, he must at least write his future title, Plain-Clothed Hero, in it. Of course, people like him wouldn't know what a hero would do. On the contrary, the instinct of extortion and blackmail had successfully integrated into his bones and blood. You guy, I'm talking about you. You're wearing a purple robe and a copper mask. At first glance, you don't look like a good Japanese person. Walking into the ruins of a commercial town that had almost turned into ashes, Abe Bijui and his followers saw a strangely dressed foreigner in the ruins. He must be the owner of a shop here. He must be secretly sad in the ruins of his shop. Seizing the opportunity, he showed his true colors as a scoundrel. Under the eyes of the plain-clothed hero, a follower immediately pulled out a short knife used to butcher fish and stepped forward to provoke and question him. It seemed that even a blind frog needs to be squeezed out some oil. But like most small characters who couldn't live past the second episode of the story, I was really blind at that time was what they probably wanted to say the most after the event, if they still had a chance. The strange outlander dressed in a purple robe and a gold mask just quietly walked past this group of people. Without others noticing, he patted his shoulder, pulled his clothes, and finished casting the spell. He calmly retreated. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Following Commander Wenfeng, who led the way for him, the Grand Weasel turned into an underground tunnel newly dug by the pickaxe Fire Dwarf. He stood in the commercial town for a moment to observe. In fact, He just wanted to confirm the disaster after the fire. Just as he was thinking that it was still not enough, someone gave him a pillow when he was sleepy. With the Grand Weasel's glib code and a crisp snap of his fingers, the 7 people who were patted on the shoulder, including Abe Bijouy, turned around in unison. Abe Bijouy straightened his coarse clothes and led the way out of the ruins of the commercial town. The streets in the middle of Chuyin City were wide enough to serve as an isolation zone, so the buildings were relatively well preserved in the fire. In this place adjacent to the Senate, most of the residents were family members of the colonial rulers of the vassal states, as well as the most powerful merchants of the Neon Empire. The first exchange office of the Neon Empire was located here. The owner of this building and this bank-like institution was the president of the Senate, and the actual manager was the president's grandson. At this time, the general manager of the exchange office was really anxious like a grandson. Whoever wants to risk his life for the chair in the office on the 3rd floor in the future is a grandson. Fire. Why didn't it burn more cleanly and burn those merchants and the families of the foreign kings to death? The price of land in Chuyin City is so many times higher than its actual value. But now this unexpected disaster has to be borne by the insurance of the exchange office. The large loan from Jiangjin has not been recovered in time, and the damn general emptied the safe of the exchange office. Next, there may be a bank run. Self-reproach could not ease his anxiety at this time. His fingers gently rubbed the iron oak door of the exchange office, which was enchanted with a special, strengthening spell. Because of the protection of the spell, this door, which had a history of more than 300 years, was still firmly guarding the wealth of the exchange office. The oak texture of the door was a whirlpool pattern. The fire yesterday did not cause much damage to it, except for blackening one side of the door. However, the heat of the extinguished fire seemed to be transmitted to the inside of the door. The general manager, who was touching it, even felt a little hot at this time. But in the end, he made up his mind not to break the tradition of 300 years. He opened the door and let the exchange office operate as usual. A large number of spellcasters and garrison guards had secretly made preparations to prevent the impact. The nobles of the Senate also said that they would not ask for the insurance compensation for the exchange office after the burning of Chuyin City for the time being. Let's not care about it and open the door for business. The core financial institution of Japan, which was originally developed to solve the need for foreign currency exchange and trade, opened its door. The smoke that had not yet dispersed and the dust dancing in the wind were blocked outside by an invisible barrier. This costly magic barrier prevented harmful substances from invading the business hall, leaving only the slightly warm breeze and the aroma of burnt fruit unfiltered. Breathing in the slightly sweet air, the general manager of the exchange office could not help but wonder if there would be a chance to directly replace this filter barrier with a force field wall in the future. There was no long line outside the door. A lookout had already reported this matter. Although he still could not take it lightly, the general manager was indeed relieved. After all, a disaster was a disaster. After a disaster, people would often be immersed in the grief of losing their loved ones and would not have time to exchange the money. The general manager straightened his lapel. And last night's fire also burned some people's storage credentials, right? No one could withdraw their deposits without credentials. This was a clear rule in the regulations. The general manager rolled up his sleeves. The guard in the city must have prioritized the Japanese natives in the fire last night. Those undisciplined people might take advantage of the chaos to rob, kill, and steal. It would be best if they killed the foreign merchants. It would be best if they robbed the deposit slips. The general manager loosened his waist knife. He remembered what his blood grandfather, the actual tyrant, said to him last night. If you can't guard the door of the business hall of the first exchange office, then take the lead to cut open your stomach with this knife to apologize. Looking at the knife at his waist, the disgust in his heart could not be any greater. Calling the attendant servant, the general manager took off the knife and threw it over. Go to the pawn counter and ask the counter manager how much this knife is worth. Get some change and send it to me. Watching the servant run away quickly, he suddenly regretted it. What happened? Why was he so reckless today? If the first exchange office is open for business, it's really a reputable exchange office. Can you see if this futures note can be withdrawn immediately? A merchant dressed as a Japanese came over with a note used for the delivery of futures products. The content on the note was not carefully read. It was nothing more than what the transaction was, what the delivery date was, and what was written at the end of the note. If the transaction cannot be completed for some reason, the liquidated damages paid to the first exchange office in advance will be used to compensate the rights and interests of the holder of this note. Futures trading was a new Japanese financial product proposed by the general manager himself in the past 2 years. It was originally to use the deposits paid in advance by merchants to make up for the deficit in the treasury. But now it had become a death sentence for him. The originally envisioned bank runs and insurance claimants did not come to him. The futures traders, who had participated under the strong persuasion of his employees, came to him to ask for liquidated damages. The general manager sucked in a breath of cold air. He wanted to stall for time, but the servant who had pawned his saber for money ran over at this moment, carrying a bag of silver coins that were obviously worth more than the saber. Just as the general manager broke out in a cold sweat and was about to signal the sorcerer in the dark to quietly erase the person's memory, he saw more and more merchants rushing to the market not far away. He could only stuff the money bag handed over by the servant into the man's hand and quickly ran into the hall. He wanted to use magic to inform his grandfather in the Senate to send more people to help, but he heard the futures trader behind him weighing the weight of the money bag and muttering to himself, sending a little punk Ching-E to inform the exchange office that the futures trading will be carried out as normal today. And he even paid without an accountant counting. Giving money happily aside, this kind of irresponsible attitude is especially undesirable. I have to quickly withdraw my savings. Who was Ching-E? Chapter 155. Rust City had once been glorious. Back then, it had an old name that evoked reverie, Stainless Steel City. The origin of this name came from a meteorite outside the city. Legend had it that after a god died, he turned into a star and fell in this area, causing the city to be covered in sand. The high-quality iron sand that could be found everywhere, coupled with the large amount of coal that had been excavated in the surroundings, made this place slowly become the city of iron smelting in the United States. The various tools and weapons made of meteorite iron were not only soft and hard, but they also had the beyonder characteristics of corrosion resistance and rust resistance. These local specialties were sold to the various cities of the United States through an endless stream of caravans, in exchange for good wine, food, spices, and other goods, as well as more ironsmiths who settled here to work. Back then, Stainless Steel City was also known as the City of Blacksmiths. It was the city of gifts from the gods that many Americans yearned for. However, after hundreds of years of mining, even if it was really the body of a god, the meteorite iron sand around the city had been depleted. In the beginning, they could still rely on the blacksmith resources they had accumulated to purchase iron or from other places and process it to maintain the ironware business. However, when people discovered that the iron products of Stainless Steel City would rust, and several high-quality iron ores were discovered in other parts of the United States, the city began to decline. The city involuntarily became decadent. After losing a large number of precious craftsmen, the Stainless Steel City gradually became a rust city. The bluestone bricks that had been purchased from other places at a high price had been weathered and damaged. They could only be repaired with red clay bricks mixed with the roots of needlegrass. The city guards leaned against the patched battlements, bored to death as they waited for the next change of guard. In the vast desert, the air was stagnant like a prism. A group of people driving carts seemed to have stopped with time. Although they could be seen moving, they didn't seem to be getting any closer. The guards on duty took turns counting the number of carts, but they couldn't come to a conclusion. It was a transport caravan that was here to transport coal. Ever since they lost their flagship product, stainless steel, Rust City's remaining industries could only be supported by the coal mined underground. Every day, Merchants or official purchasing teams from other cities would come to purchase coal. The former bought a limited amount, while the latter suppressed the price too much. It wasn't as profitable as the ironware business in the past. Rust City's wealth was getting thinner and thinner. It's Old Camel's caravan, 25 carts. Haha, I won the bet. Tomorrow, you'll be on duty for me. Looking at the approaching convoy, the garrison's soldier who lost the bet cursed in a low voice. However, he still hurriedly pulled the spiral arm to lift the city gate with the others so that the purchasing caravan could enter the city for trade. As he worked, he wondered if he should go in exchange for some new grain brought by the caravan. At the very least, he could fill up the empty rice and flour jar at home. A breeze suddenly blew, stirring up the flags on the city wall, making a flapping sound. You're in luck, Old Camel. You've just entered the city and the wind is already blowing. The guard who was familiar with the caravan owner and won the bet congratulated him. In the desert, there were only two types of weather, wind and no wind. When a breeze blew, a terrifying sandstorm would sweep over in a moment. The shadows of birds appeared on the horizon. This was normal. When birds sensed the approaching sandstorm, they would instinctively look for cities as a shelter. The guards in the city exchanged glances with each other. After they finished their sentry duty, they would secretly borrow their crossbows to shoot two birds for a sumptuous meal. Gray geese could be roasted directly. Red-breasted black geese's feathers could be collected and sold for money. Hard-headed white geese's forehead was also very valuable. While they were thinking about how to cook different types of prey, the older guard captain suddenly jumped up from the base of the watchtower on the city wall. He shaded his eyes with his hands and looked into the distance. It doesn't look like a bird. It's too big. Enemy attack. The senile Rust City was awakened by the alarm. The guards, who were already familiar with the changes in the city, could not ignore the real white cloud dog with cloud wings on its back. The general gave the order, and the Tengu family launched a surprise attack on Rust City. This city, which had no sense of existence in Medic, was a strategic location that could not be abandoned in the eyes of the Japanese. Except for the flagships of the Senate families, which were supported by a large number of anti-gravity floating magic circles, most of the ships in series were lifted into the air by huge balloons made of leather that had been purified by alchemy potions. To fill these balloons, a special furnace was needed to constantly heat a large amount of air. Stepping on the gangplanks on both sides of the ship, hundreds of tall and strong slaves continuously sent coal into the furnace with baskets on their backs. In order to supply the fuel required by the furnace, a few of the ships suspended below the balloon were specially set aside to store fuel. However, after some calculations, these reserves were still not enough to support the air fleet's attack on Bite, the capital of Medic. Therefore, the key to victory was to capture Rust City first to obtain enough coal reserves. At the same time, it was a good opportunity to use the Tengu family to test the air attack tactics and see if this new mode of war was feasible. The war in the Ash World, whether it was the field battle between two armies, the attack and defense of cities, or the struggle for hegemony on the sea, was actually still in a relatively primitive form. The Japanese had the ambition to become the slave masters of all the worlds in the universe. After a lot of contact with the foreign world, they naturally gradually realized the shortcomings of the war in the Ash World. Although it was much more advanced than the more primitive ritual war, in which the two sides set a time and place, and each side sent a person or an army to compete for the victory, it still did not break away from the hammer and anvil tactics. On land, the infantry was like an anvil to delay the enemy's main force, and elite troops, such as cavalry, were like hammers to repeatedly attack the enemy's formation. In the sea battle, special warships were used to tangle with the enemy's fleet, and warships equipped with long-range weapons would surround the enemy's ships in a single column or in a horizontal formation and repeatedly attack the enemy's ships. The battle in the air was mostly entrusted to the riders riding vultures, griffins, and other flying mounts. As for attacking the ground from the air, there was no way to achieve an effective three-dimensional attack by relying only on weapons such as arrows and spears. At this time, In order to cooperate with the Tengu family's air attack, the Japanese craftsmen had also prepared some new weapons for them. Pay attention to the flying height. Don't waste your energy shooting at the defenders with your feet. When you find the target, immediately release the falling flame strike. Alert team, pay attention to the search for the sorcerers in the air. Once you find them, launch an attack. The chief of the Tengu family vividly repeated the words of the tactical staff officer under the general's command. It did not sound noisy at all. The spiral wings vibrated loudly, and the alert team members scattered in all directions to find the spellcasters who might be a threat. The rest of the Tengu warriors quickly flew forward with their chief. There was still a small problem when using the falling flame strike, because it was the first time they threw this alchemy bomb containing white phosphorus. A Tengu accidentally rubbed it on itself. Fortunately, its painful cry and tragic fall attracted the attention of the rest of the Tengu family. The rest of the falling flame strike that they carried mostly bombed the mansion of the governor of Rust City. Presumably, the alert team, which was specially sent to deal with the sorcerers, was quite successful. The taxes of Rust City could only support a small number of spellcasters. Among them, the most powerful one was only a senior gray-robed sorcerer who was applying for the black robe certification. When the city was attacked by the Tengu army, the sorcerers who were about to fly into the air on their flying carpets were continuously shot by arrows. Compared to ordinary human beings, the Tengu, who had bird claws, could control the cloud wings with one hand and hold a sword with the other. At the same time, they could use a special bow to shoot. In the simulation before the battle, the Japanese tactical staff officer had considered the problem of how to deal with the sorcerers. The Tengu of the alert team had not only received long-term shooting training with bows, but also received 3 enchanted armor-piercing arrows that were enchanted with anti-stone spell before they set off. The medic spellcasters, who were not prepared, were severely injured as soon as they encountered the well-prepared enemies. Several of the gray-robed sorcerers were killed by the arrows one after another. The white-robed apprentices who were driving the flying carpets quickly found a chance to land and escape. Like Aigu in Sparut City, the governor of Rust City was a rare noble with the blood of the pharaoh. He was also the governor of a city. But unlike Aigu, his family had been living in this city for several generations. It was precisely because of the important value of this stainless steel city that his ancestors were entrusted with the responsibility of supervising and managing this place by the pharaoh. At this time, the governor's mansion was protected by the flames. The garrison soldiers could not rush in to rescue him. The alchemy bomb, falling flame strike, could burn for a long time after it exploded. All the mortals who were touched by the alchemy flame, such as the guards, eunuchs, family members of the consul, and so on, will be turned into human-shaped torches howling in pain, just like the careless heavenly hound. Trying to extinguish the alchemy flame with water would not only backfire, but also produce more deadly poisonous smoke. Only by isolating the air with a large amount of sand could the flame be completely extinguished. The sorcerers of Rust City, who could not resist the Tengu troops in the air, hurried over. They mobilized the magic power stored in the obsidian magic beads and prepared to open a path with earth and stone. The ear-piercing buzzing sound came from the sky. The Tengu troops were fiddling with the joysticks and adjusting the speed of the cloud wings. Hurriedly putting on special asbestos robes, the Tengu transformed into agile warriors and rushed to the center of the governor's mansion with their short swords. As expected, the governor of Rust City, whose family was being held hostage, chose to surrender directly. The first order he gave was to arrest the sorcerers in the city. Naturally, the result was chaos. After losing a few white-robed apprentices, the sorcerers escaped into the fortress guarded by the sorcerers with the help of the poisonous snakes that climbed on the machetes of the samurai and the little devils that climbed on the shoulders of the guards. However, this stubborn resistance was soon broken. The arrival of the Wusong airship fleet meant that Rust City was completely under the control of the sorcerers. The air raid and decapitation of the Tengu troops created a new type of war that had never been seen before in the Ash world. A large amount of coal that was supposed to be transported away by merchants was quickly loaded into the cabins by the large mechanical cranes hanging down from the airships. The Wusong airships had collected enough food. However, the Neon Empire's gains from the air attack, led by the general of the Neon Empire, could only be regarded as a Pyrrhus victory compared to the losses in the financial crisis that the Great Dimensional had prepared for them across the ocean. From this point of view, the last factor that influenced the trend of the two battlefields, Abe Byoshi in Chuyin City and the governor of Rust City, was more important than the latter. As the saying went, even a Byoshi can be arrogant in the face of a king. Chapter 156. The most senior sorcerer in Rust City finally got his long-cherished wish. He received the authorization document needed to be promoted to a black-robed sorcerer. He also received a recommendation letter stamped with the seal of Pasha's treasure, which guaranteed that he could go to the Magic Research Institute in Byte to further his studies. In Keys's opinion, the deaf sorcerer was indeed qualified. The fact that he could complete both casting actions and spell model construction at the same time, without using any spells, proved that he had a solid theoretical foundation. Moreover, he also had two indispensable talents to become a master of spells. Good luck. When the Japanese attacked Rust City, he was shot by an arrow and fell into a residential area. He did not have time to retreat to the sorcerer's fortress and thus survived. Keen insight. When he was hiding and waiting for help, he saw that an attacker was accidentally hit by his own weapon and burned in flames. He quickly collected the body that had not been completely burned and presented it to Keys as a meeting gift. This is the Tengu, a native Japanese humanoid race. They don't have the ability to fly. They can launch a surprise attack from the air with the help of these mechanical objects. The wounded, gray-robed sorcerer retreated. The young blue dragon in human form inspected the remains of the attacker, wrapped in a bag, enchanted with a temporary spell, and explained to everyone present. He broke off a piece of the remains that had been burned to the bone marrow and rubbed it slightly. A yellow flame ignited in the air. Keys identified the smell of a thin layer of white smoke in the air. He was sure that the weapons used by the attackers contain a large amount of white phosphorus. At this time, his magic consultant, Snade, also joined in. However, this half-lich was not interested in the body at all. Instead, he was very interested in the metal bag on the Tengu's back. After tearing off the iron coat on the bag, the structure of the bag was revealed. A small steam furnace, a high-efficiency heating device with a small amount of magic enchantments and alchemy materials, various mechanical interlocking devices. With a little bit of imagination, one could basically infer that the high-pressure steam was turned into the power to rotate the helical wings with these mechanical parts. That was how the Tengu was equipped with the wings to fly back to the sky. Keys, who knew the characteristics of the Tengu, immediately remembered the creature's talent of mimicry. The three-headed young blue dragon heard the red dragon's low growl. It was very likely that it came from one of the Tengu's throat. We can't just sit there and wait for death. I mean, we have to think of a way to take the initiative to attack. For example, we can gather the mages and set up a thunderstorm on their path, or we can summon enough flying lions. Oh hell, we can't let those guys who attacked Medici City just walk away like that. The speaker was the Pasha of the province where Rust City was located. When Keys received the military intelligence from the sniffer, the highest officials of the provinces along the way also received the same news. This Pasha was related to the governor of Rust City by marriage. His daughter was the wife of the surrendered marquis. However, his thin face and neat stick-like beard on his chin constantly trembled, revealing the anger and anxiety of the governor at this time. Unlike the stick-shaped beard, who was eager to make up for his negligence in defending the territory, Marshal Medici, who had just rushed to the front line from Byte City to unify the military forces between the provinces, intercepting the Nirui River and launching an unprecedented airstrike, had prompted the pharaoh to send Medici's military commander-in-chief to carry out a comprehensive defense. This veteran general, who had directly conscripted dozens of black-robed mages and used a combination of teleportation spells and flying carpets to rush over with his personal guards, had a different judgment from the Pasha. It seemed that the pot-bellied general's skill in drawing maps was inherited from his old commanding officer, except that the Marshal of Medici used a more sophisticated magic sand table. The spellcasters among the accompanying guards projected the virtual mountains and rivers into the assembly hall of Rust City, and the old marshal in gray clothes walked from Spat City to Rust City. It takes 10 hourglasses to cover the distance of 734 parescens without wind, so the Wusan airship travels at a speed of 82 parescens per hourglass. This speed is slower than the flying carpets at full speed, but it's still beyond my previous estimation. He walked to the route that marked the slowly shrinking distance between the Wusan airship fleet and Bite City. Immediately, a lot of information about the soldiers, the garrison sorcerers, and the governors of the cities appeared above the virtual images of several cities along the way. Then, he deployed the troops that had been retreating from the port cities in the north and found several ways to quickly reinforce these cities. Originally, we wanted to rely on the high mountains along the way to mobilize the spellcasters to build temporary defensive fortresses, so that we could intercept them step by step. But the Wusan airships are still too fast, and the defensive lines we set up will only add fuel to the fire in the end. We have to find a way to slow down the airship first, and then find a way to finish the job in one fell swoop. After listening to their judgment, Keyes could not help but glance at his magic consultant. According to Marshal Medici's plan, slowing down the airship was the highlight of the whole plan, and there was no doubt that they would try to persuade Lucien to let the Blue Dragon race chase after the airship. But they did not know that this idea was just wishful thinking. Not to mention that they did not have as much influence as the Penishade Dragon Queen. Even if they wanted to tempt Keyes, except for the Grand Vader and Pharaoh, no one in Medici could offer something that the young Blue Dragon was particularly interested in. After all, Keyes was not the kind of idiot who only liked to count money. He had used his own money to exchange the Soul Prism for silver and used it to bombard the Thanner Re-Demons. This was an unprecedented act of an ancient dragon. Besides, the plan of finishing the job in one fell swoop was very difficult to achieve. The Wusan military operations were obviously trying to upgrade the mode of war, while the old Marshal's plan was still stuck in the inherent thinking of hammer and anvil tactics. Perhaps in terms of age, Keyes did not have as much experience as the old Marshal, but thanks to his experience as a keyboard warrior and the baptism of the Hell paratroopers in the lower realm, he was actually quite familiar with the blitzkrieg combat concept of the Wusan. In comparison, although they used large-scale teleportation spells to airdrop behind enemy lines, the bloody battle led by the evil Dragon Council and the Penishade Dragon Queen against the Bottomless Abyss was more like a deep battle on the strategic level, while the Wusan general's expedition against Medici was still limited to a blitzkrieg on the tactical level. The former used the assault force to first break through the enemy's blockade, and then, after stabilizing the channel coordinates, the Avernus Legion of Devils and the Evil Dragon Army would launch an all-out attack. The ultimate strategic goal was to eliminate all the demons in the Acid Fog Canyon realm and even pull the entire realm into the 9 prisons of Bader. The latter used the airship, an advanced mobile force, to break through the ground blockade, but the purpose was not to wipe out all the living forces. Instead, it was to attack Medici's capital city. There were 2 prerequisites for them to dare to take such an action. First, the Wusan must be prepared to attack Bite City from the air, and second, they must have the same effective countermeasure against Medici's aerial interception. Although the Wusan army was certainly not as sharp as the demons in the lower realm, the overall strength of the Wusan army was not to be underestimated, since they could use such a tactic that was beyond the level of the Ash World. Part of old Marshal Medici's plan was correct. It would not make much sense to ask the cities along the way to send armed forces to intercept the airship. It would also be easy for the Wusan to detect it and lead them to change their course to attack the defenseless cities. However, It was wishful thinking to rely on the dragons to slow down the Wusan airship and make it fall into the death trap of Medici's temporary anti-air fortress. Not to mention whether they could set up an aerial Maginot line of defense. Even if they could do it with the help of a large number of spellcasters, the history of Keyes' previous life had proven that this kind of static defense could not effectively stop the blitzkrieg type of dynamic assault. If the young blue dragon had the ability to mobilize a large number of dragons like the evil Dragon Congress, the Wusan airship fleet would certainly be vulnerable to the attack of the Megalosaurus, the overlord of the sky. However, there were only a dozen young dragons left in the dragon's nest. There were still some young dragons and dragon eggs waiting to hatch. Judging from the number of heavenly hounds attacking Rust City, the Wusan probably had more backup plans. Unless Keyes decided to fight head-on, chasing after the Wusan airship would only be asking for trouble. If the game on the top of the cloud could be compared to a gambling game, before the Japanese, who loved to cheat, put all their chips on the table, they had to reveal their cards. Even if they were Gao, they could not guarantee that they would lose a lot of money on the spot. In fact, it was the stick-bearded Pasha who suggested a more feasible solution in his anxiety. Let the spellcasters of Medicus set up a spell that could affect the weather. Thunderstorm might not be able to guarantee a 100% chance of hitting the enemy, but the cold air would definitely be a hindrance. In addition to the flagship airships, the Wusan Expeditionary Army has the most airships, which rely on huge balloons to provide lift. Their raid on Rust City to plunder coal revealed that this kind of weapon requires a large amount of fuel reserves. Once they encounter cold air, the balloons will first dry up due to thermal expansion and contraction. In order to maintain flight at a high enough altitude, they will inevitably consume more coal. In the cold air, the efficiency of the furnaces will also decrease, and the consumption of coal will increase exponentially. In this way, due to the lack of fuel, the airships will not only be slowed down, but they may also attack cities that are not part of the plan to obtain more coal. If we ambush the Wusan airships in Medici's coal production area, once the Wusan airships descend, they will be like tigers without teeth and claws. In order not to let the others waste their time persuading him, Keyes spoke his plan first. You're tuning into the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.